You're about to hear 30 true horror stories, all set on the last day of high school. Real people, real events, and what should have been a normal day filled with yearbooks and goodbyes turned into something unforgettable. So turn the lights off, if you dare, and listen closely. Because some of these students never made it to graduation. I'd always considered Greystone High an aging relic, with creaking floors and outdated lockers that groaned under the weight of decades. But that day, the building felt alive, its shadows slithering along the walls, and the overhead lights flickering like weak heartbeats. I'm Jordan, a senior on the cusp of graduation, and while most of my classmates were celebrating the end of an era, I couldn't shake the disturbing sensation that the school was trying to tell me something. I first noticed it in homeroom. The clock on the wall, an ancient analog contraption with chipped numbers, seemed to pause at 2:37 p.m., the very moment the final bell had echoed through every classroom. I recalled how, earlier that day, teachers had exchanged uneasy glances as they hurriedly dismissed their classes. Even Mr. Dunbar, our usually jovial history teacher, had his smile wiped away as he muttered something about unfinished business as the students rushed out the door. The halls, normally infused with the chatter and laughter of teenagers eager for freedom, were now a canvas of unsettling quiet. I walked alone, each step echoing unnaturally loud against the linoleum floor. Every classroom door was left unlatched, as if hurriedly abandoned. Open books lay scattered on desks, their pages fluttering in a draft that I couldn't feel. The windows, usually revealing a bright, late spring sky, reflected only deepening shadows in the eerie silhouette of the old oak out front. At first, I blamed my jittery nerves on the excitement of summer break, but soon, the strange happenings multiplied. In the art room, I saw colors on the easels that weren't there before, a sickly green and bruised purple swirling into shapes that resembled anguished faces. In the library, the hum of the fluorescent lights beat in a hypnotic rhythm, and the dusty volumes on the shelves seemed to pulse as though they bore secret lives of their own. I heard, then, a faint sound, like a whisper, barely audible over the hush of the building. It was as if someone, or something, was calling my name from the depths of a forgotten classroom. Compelled by equal parts dread and curiosity, I made my way toward the source of the whisper. I followed a narrow hallway that led to the old science lab, a room whispered about in hushed tones among upperclassmen for its reputation of strange experiments and even stranger incidents. The door to the lab was ajar, and a flickering light spilled out, seemingly coming from within. I hesitated only a moment before pushing it open. Inside, the remnants of long-ago experiments were scattered across workbenches and stained sinks. Broken vials, dusty textbooks on quantum theory, and faded diagrams of astronomical phenomena littered the room. But what caught my eye was a chalkboard on which a message had been scrawled in erratic, trembling lines. The last bell echoes. We are here. The words appeared to be written in a hurry, as if by a trembling hand. The room's temperature dropped drastically, so that each exhaled breath became visible in the cold air, and an inexplicable dread clawed at me. I backed out of the lab and found myself in the corridor again. The whisper grew louder, a cacophony of fractured voices layered on top of one another. I couldn't make out their words, only that they were agonized, pleading, almost accusatory. As I peered into a classroom near the back of the building, I saw it, a glimpse of movement in one of the darkened corners. Shadows shifted and coalesced into a vague human shape, a child perhaps, or the ghost of a student lost long ago. The figure melted away before I could focus on it, leaving behind an echo of soft sobbing. It wasn't long before panic began to ripple among the few remaining students who'd stayed behind, stranded by inexplicable circumstances, while the rest had fled. In a cluster near the cafeteria, I heard frantic whispers about dormitory lights going out, mysterious knocks on closed doors, and a rumor that the principal had vanished without a trace. My own terror merged with morbid fascination. The building itself was changing. As I moved through the halls, I realized that familiar areas were now distorted. The staircase that once led down to the gym now appeared to stretch into darkness that seemed endless, and narrow hallways curved in impossible angles. Every door I passed carried its own secret, voices behind closed panels, fleeting reflections in dusty mirrors, and an almost imperceptible but constant humming, as though the building was resonating with untold sorrow. I caught sight of my friend Marcus near the auditorium, his face pale and eyes wide with terror. "Jordan, something's wrong," he whispered urgently. I heard the bell again. It rang, even though we're past the final class." His voice trembled, and he clutched a fraying strap of his backpack. "Listen, every time it rings, it's like a countdown, like we're running out of time." We didn't have long to debate. In the distance, a resonant clang echoed through the hall, the sound of the school bell, clear as day. But it was not the celebratory chime of freedom. It was a mournful, hollow sound that seemed to reverberate in the very walls. The sound sent shivers down our spines, and we exchanged terrified glances. Marcus grabbed my arm. "We have to get out of here." But as we turned to leave, we found that the exit had vanished. Where a door should have been now loomed an impenetrable wall of brick. The corridors pulsated, as if alive, and the air grew thick with despair. We ran, desperate to find any escape, but the building twisted around us. Every turn revealed new horrors. Classrooms filled with tangled desks and chairs moving as if animated by unseen hands, hallways that stretched longer than possible, and echoes of past laughter that morphed into tortured screams. In the gymnasium, I saw a vision of our class from years past, frozen in time, their faces contorted in silent screams as if caught in the midst of some unspeakable calamity. Their eyes seemed to lock with mine, pleading for deliverance. As the dread mounted, I realized that the school wasn't just haunted by memories of tragedies past. It was possessed by a malevolent spirit, crafted from the very essence of despair, an entity that had lain dormant in the school's foundations, waiting for the final day to rise again. It was feeding on our collective fear, transmuting the last moments of an ending into an everlasting nightmare. Around midnight, the building reached its crescendo. In the silent, darkened library, I crept between towering shelves filled with ancient, dust-covered volumes. The low hum of the building grew into a resonant orchestra of murmurs, as if every book were reciting a dirge. I felt compelled to pull a frayed, leather-bound journal off the shelf. Its cover bore the embossed title, "The Final Dismissal." I flipped through pages of cryptic entries, accounts of strange happenings each last day of school in decades past, warnings scrawled in frantic handwriting. One entry ended abruptly, with a single sentence: "When the bell tolls one last time, the lost take their due." A terrible realization took root in my mind. The school itself was not simply a building, but a threshold between our world and something far worse. The final bell every year was not an end, but an invitation, a gateway for the entity to reclaim what it had lost. And today, on this final day, that invitation was being fulfilled. As panic overtook me, I raced through the hallways with Marcus by my side. Our footsteps pounded the tiling in a staccato rhythm that mirrored our racing hearts. We navigated through corridors that defied geometry, always feeling as though something unseen was trailing us. The persistent, spectral ringing of the bell, the last echo of despair, followed us everywhere. At one point, we reached an abandoned classroom where the walls were scrawled with frantic warnings. "Do not stay. Leave now." The handwriting, almost illegible, dripped with urgency and fear. In the final moments before dawn, as despair reached its zenith, the building itself began to collapse in on its own accord. The floors trembled violently, and the sound of shattering glass and splintering wood filled the air. Marcus and I clung to each other as we stumbled toward what we hoped was an exit. All around us, the victims of previous final days seemed to rise from the shadows. faded specters of students and teachers long gone, gliding silently in the periphery, their empty eyes urging us to abandon hope. At last we reached the auditorium, a grand chamber once filled with applause and cheers. Now it was a cavern of echoing sorrow. The stage lay in ruins, draped in decaying curtains that fluttered in a wind that came from nowhere. At the center of the stage was a massive, ancient bell, suspended by chains that creaked ominously. Its surface was etched with symbols and the faces of anguished souls. Marcus's trembling hand reached out as if drawn by an irresistible force. Before I could stop him, the bell tolled, a deep, resonant sound that erupted like a scream. The vibrations shook the very foundations of the auditorium as if it were the doomsday countdown. The entire building shuddered in response. The spectral figures in the shadows began to move toward us, their forms becoming more distinct, more horrific. Their voices, once a whisper, now rose in a crescendo of wailing lament. Desperation gripped me as the auditorium filled with darkness. The bell's toll was not the comforting promise of an end to our torment. It was the catalyst for something far more terrible. The walls melted into an abyss, and the ground rippled like liquid black ink. I could no longer stand the crushing weight of the fear. It was as though the school itself was devouring our souls. In that final, harrowing moment, with the auditorium collapsing around us and the wailing figures reaching out with spectral hands, Marcus's eyes met mine with a silent plea. To let go. To escape the nightmare. But escape, I realized, was no longer a possibility. The night was endless, and the school's curse had been unleashed once again on its final day. And as the darkness enveloped us entirely, I felt the echo of the last bell pulse in my chest. There was no resolution, only the certainty that Greystone High would never truly be abandoned. Its halls, its ghosts, its endless despair were bound to the final day, the last day of school. A day that would forever repeat its horror for those trapped between remembrance and oblivion. The final lock-in. It was supposed to be the happiest day. A sunlit last day of school, the promise of endless summer freedom. But as the final bell rang, echoing through the labyrinthine corridors of St. Bartholomew High, a malignant silence settled over the building. I was Alex Mercer, a senior with plans for college and dreams of escaping town. But that day, as my classmates poured out into the golden afternoon, I was inexplicably drawn back. I couldn't explain why, but something in the vacant halls called out to me, as if the school itself was unwilling to let go. The morning had been normal enough. Lockers slammed shut in hurried dismissal. Laughter and chatter filled the air, and even the ancient clock in homeroom had seemed to smile as it struck the final hour. But as I walked out with the throng of students, I noticed a door ajar behind me, a door I was certain had been bolted shut. Its peeling paint and slanted hinges gave it the aura of neglect, but there was something else in its silent invitation. Curiosity and dread wrestled within me. Before I knew it, I found myself turning back. The corridor beyond was dimly lit, the fluorescent lights flickering erratically as if struggling against an unseen force. The hall smelled of stale air and dust, a stark contrast to the laughter outside. I stepped forward and immediately sensed that this was not the familiar school I had known all my life. The walls seemed to pulse with a life of their own, and distant echoes carried voices that shouldn't have been there. I pressed my hand against the cool, chipped plaster and felt a tremor like a heartbeat coursing through it. I wandered aimlessly at first, drawn deeper into the forgotten recesses of the school. Each classroom I passed was frozen in time. Textbooks lay open on desks, half-written notes scrawled in hurried script on chalkboards. Some rooms were dark and empty, while others flickered with ghostly images. A fleeting glimpse of a figure at the window or a chair slowly rocking as if recently used. The normally comforting routine of the school day had given way to a calendar of hushed secrets and hidden horrors. My pulse quickened as I entered the library, a vast space once filled with the murmurs of reading students, now eerily silent. The air was thick with dust, and an almost tangible sorrow. Rows upon rows of books lined the walls, but many of the volumes had been pulled off the shelves, their contents spilled across the floor in disarray. In one corner, a table was littered with crumpled pages and faded photographs of students long graduated. I recognized one face, a pale, haunted girl with eyes that seemed to plead for help. Had she been one of us? The rumor had always been that a student had vanished on the last day decades ago, swallowed by the corridors of the old school, leaving only whispered legends in its wake. I pressed on, my footsteps echoing on the polished floor, until I reached a narrow corridor I'd never seen before. The walls here were scrawled with frantic writing in a shaky hand. They never let us leave. The final bell is not the end. The words sent shudders of dread down my spine. I tried to rationalize it as a prank, but deep down, every fiber of my being screamed that something was wrong. The corridor led to a set of double doors that I hesitated before opening. Inside was the old detention room, a place infamous among upperclassmen for the ghost stories spun around it. The room was dim and musty, the remnants of life long abandoned. In one corner, a rusted metal chair sat beneath a window that looked out onto a dark courtyard. The only light came from a weak bulb hanging overhead, its flickering beam creating shifting patterns on the stained floor. As I stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind me with a force that stole my breath away. I tried it, locked tight. My heart pounded as I moved to the window. Outside, the courtyard was unnaturally still, a void of darkness broken only by the silhouette of the old oak tree, whose twisted branches clawed at the sky. Then I noticed a movement behind me in the mirror-like surface of the window, a pale face framed by chaotic hair, its eyes hollow with despair. I spun around, but the room was empty. I heard a whisper, soft and trembling. "Don't leave us." And the image dissolved into the shadows. Desperation turned to icy terror as I frantically tried the door. It wouldn't budge. My cell phone's light was my only guide in that suffocating darkness. With trembling fingers, I began to pace, straining to detect any sound of movement or another plea. The silence was suddenly broken by the unmistakable sound of footsteps outside, slow, measured taps echoing in the hallway. They were not hurried, they were methodical, as though someone, or something, was drawing closer with purpose. I crept to the door and pressed my ear against it. Faint voices drifted through, incomprehensible and layered, intermingling memories with warnings. I couldn't tell if they were cries for help or screams of agony. Fear blurred the line between reality and nightmare. In the distance, somewhere far beyond the walls of the detention room, I heard the final chime of a school bell, a resonant, mournful toll that seemed to mark the passing of the world I once knew. Time lost meaning as I became trapped in that room. At one point, I glimpsed shapes moving just outside the peripheral vision, a flash of a student's uniform, the muted smile of a teacher from decades past. The ghosts of St. Bartholomew High had returned on their final day of school, their souls tethered to the fading memories of a place that refused to let go. They whispered secrets of unresolved grief and unfinished lessons, their voices carrying the weight of all those who had been forgotten. The oppressive atmosphere weighed on me. I felt an inexplicable pull to the far side of the room where an old cabinet stood. Its door was slightly ajar, revealing shelves lined with fading photographs, report cards, and scrapbooks. My hand trembled as I opened it fully. Inside, among the dusty relics, I found a diary bound in cracked leather. The handwriting was frantic, nearly illegible in parts. Accounts of a final day from long ago, where fear and despair had overcome reason. One entry ended abruptly with a single chilling sentence. "Tonight, we become one with the halls." A sudden chill swept through the room as I clutched the diary to my chest. The door behind me creaked open slowly, as if beckoning me to follow its silent invitation. I stepped toward it, every instinct warning me to run, yet something compelled me forward. The hallway beyond was barely illuminated. Shadows writhed along its length, and the remnants of childhood laughter seemed to echo from the walls. I could see faint, ghostly figures drifting through the corridor, faces half-formed and eyes pleading in silent agony. My mind raced. Was I witnessing the final hour of a living nightmare, or merely the lingering echoes of tragedies past? The deeper I ventured, the more the school revealed its true nature. The familiar corridors twisted into strange angles, and the classrooms I once knew transformed before my eyes into chambers of horror. Lockers lined the walls like silent sentinels, their doors bearing names of students who had vanished over the years. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed with unnatural intensity, casting grotesque shadows that danced with malevolent glee. At one point, I came upon an old trophy case in the gymnasium. It was shattered, and its contents, cups, medals, a faded banner, were strewn across the floor. But amid the debris, I recognized a name. My own. My heart pounded as I recalled that I had never even participated in the sports events chronicled there. Shaking, I picked up one of the tarnished medals and turned it over. Inscribed on the edge were the words, "Winner of nothing, eaten by time." I dropped the medal, its clattering sound swallowed by the oppressive silence. The school's oppressive energy was reaching its crescendo when I arrived at the old auditorium. The once glittering stage was draped in decades of dust and decay. Broken seats lay in disarray, and the curtain hung tattered and stained. I stepped cautiously onto the stage, feeling the eerie vibration of the building as if it were a living heart, pulsing in sync with my fear. Then, as if answering an unspoken command, the final bell rang once more. Its sound was deeper, more resonant than before, a toll of finality. In that moment, the glass of the stage lights cracked and shattered, scattering shards across the floor. The whispers exploded into a cacophonous chorus. Figures emerged from the darkness, spectral students in faded uniforms, teachers with vacant eyes, and even a few administrators whose expressions betrayed resignation and sorrow. They advanced slowly, their faces a blend of pleading and malevolence. One ghost approached me, a girl with a tear-streaked face and eyes that burned with eternal sadness. Her voice, barely audible, whispered, "Don't let us go." As her translucent hand reached out, I felt a surge of overwhelming despair, as if all the loneliness and pain of forgotten youth were being poured into my soul. I tried to back away, but my feet felt glued to the creaking floorboards. Around me, the auditorium transformed into a vortex of despair and rage. The walls melted into swirling patterns of agony, and the floor became a river of tears. The ghosts touched me, each contact a searing brand of memory and loss. I could see images flash through my mind, classrooms filled with laughter that turned to cries, corridors echoing with footsteps that grew heavier with each passing moment, and a final day that had become an endless cycle of torment. In the midst of this waking nightmare, time fractured. The voices of the dead overlapped with the remnants of my own thoughts. I could no longer distinguish between the living and the lost. Every scream, every whispered plea, every echo of the bell became fused into one endless dirge. I realized then that St. Bartholomew High was not merely haunted, it was cursed. Every final day, every end of term, reawakened the grief of an entire generation trapped within its walls. As the spectral figures closed in, their forms shimmering with unspoken horrors, I felt the final locking of fate. The school had claimed another soul, a permanent resident in its eternal cycle of despair. The last echoes of the bell reverberated in my chest, a mournful heartbeat that would never cease. And as darkness swallowed me whole, I knew this was no escape. It was the beginning of an endless, horrifying detention, trapped forever in a place that feasted on lost youth. I was suspended in a timeless darkness, adrift in the oppressive void of St. Bartholomew High. The last echoes of the bell still throbbed in my chest, a pulse that merged with my own heartbeat. I found myself trapped between the remnants of memory and an all-consuming nightmare, with every corridor blurred into a network of distorted hallways that defied all logic. The spectral figures, those lost souls trapped in this endless cycle of despair, drifted like broken memories along the walls. Their eyes, some pleading, others accusatory, reminded me of everything I'd once taken for granted. Now, none of it mattered. I tried to move, but my limbs felt as though they were weighted by years of unresolved grief and crushing terror. The detention room that had held me captive was no longer confined by its four walls. Instead, it had expanded into a labyrinth of surreal mirrors and shifting angles. Every footstep echoed painfully, amplified by vaulting silence that swallowed sound whole. I began to question whether I was still in the school at all, or if existence had fractured into a montage of horrors and inexplicable voids. A flicker at the edge of my vision drew my attention upward. In the far corner of what once was a familiar corridor, a door, its surface charred and etched with indecipherable scratches, hung slightly ajar. With no other option, and driven by a desperate mix of terror and determination, I staggered toward it, my heart pounding like a drum in the dark. I pressed my ear against the warped wood, and the faint sound of muffled whispers seeped out. They were too soft to make out, but they carried an urgency that beckoned me onward. Horned shadows curled around the edges of the doorway, and as I stepped inside, the temperature dropped drastically. The corridor on the other side was lined with old trophy cases and dusty lockers. Some of these bestowed brief, flickering images of students once gone, trapped in loops of despair. A girl with eyes wide in perpetual fear, a boy silently weeping into a textbook, and even an elderly teacher whose stoic face was now contorted into a grimace of sorrow. Every locker seemed to bear a name, a silent testimony to lives interrupted. I lay my hand against one cool metal surface and closed my eyes, trying to summon any semblance of courage. I recalled a time, many years ago, when the halls of St. Bartholomew had resounded with the genuine laughter of teenagers and the warm chatter of teachers. Those sounds were now replaced by the monotonous hum of a malignant presence. I pressed onward. Every step in this abandoned corridor felt like traversing a memory of pain and regret. The building was alive now, not in the sense of a heartbeat, but as something older and more relentless. It fed on our sorrow, thriving on the raw, unspoken emotions of every soul who had ever passed through its doors. The walls, which had once held simple graffiti and motivational slogans, now pulsed with a dark, viscous energy, as if they were bleeding memory. A sudden, shrill sound echoed, a crying, like that of a child lost in the darkness. I froze. The sound came from somewhere deep within the wings of the building, where I recalled the old auditorium and the stage that once hosted our graduation ceremonies. Instinctively, I ran toward that sound, hoping that the source might be my friend Marcus, or even a final call for help. Instead, as I approached the auditorium, I saw that its grand facade was altered almost beyond recognition. The wide, arched windows, which once permitted rays of sunshine to flood in, were now blackened shards, reflecting fractured images of my trembling face. The door, heavy with time and decay, creaked open with a mournful groan. Inside, the auditorium was an amalgamation of what it had once been and what it had become, a macabre theater of shadows and echoing sorrow. Tattered curtains hung limply from rusted rod, and scattered fragments of old medals and trophies glittered under a weak, flickering light. The stage was set for a final performance, and I could almost hear the ghostly strains of an orchestral crescendo. Then I saw them, spectral figures, drifting on the stage like reluctant actors frozen in mid-performance. Some were seated in rows of broken chairs, while others hovered near the wings, their eyes empty, yet full of unspeakable terror. My footsteps faltered, as one figure seemed to rise slowly from a seat in the front row. A girl, perhaps no older than 15, with a face both beautiful and desperately forlorn, looked directly at me. Her eyes, milky with tears, seemed to plead silently, "Help me." The shock of her gaze drove me back almost involuntarily. I wanted to scream, to run, and yet my body felt rooted in place. Then the stage lights, which had been intermittently sputtering, burst into life for a fleeting moment. In that sudden glare, the faces of every ghost, every trapped soul, were clear, twisted in anguish, mouths open in silent scream. The sound of a final bell rang out again, a long, resonant toll that drowned out all other sound. With it, the atmosphere shifted. The ghosts began to converge as if summoned by an unholy command. Their voices, once faint and melancholic, now swelled into a thundering chorus of despair. The building itself trembled as these voices wove into a tumultuous dirge that resonated through my bones. I realized with dawning horror that St. Bartholomew High was not merely haunted by the past, it was feeding on it. The final day was etched into its very core, a recurring cycle where unfulfilled promises and broken dreams coalesced into a living malady. The final bell had not been a signal of freedom, it was a covenant. Every graduation, every last day, was an invitation for the building to reclaim lost souls, to bind them forever in a never-ending detention. I tried to move toward the exit, desperate to escape the suffocating grip of the horror that had become my prison. Every doorway I reached melted away into solid brick. Every corridor twisted further upon itself. The spectral chorus swelled. I felt the weight of countless forgotten lives press down upon me, a palpable force built of sorrow and regret. My skin crawled as cold, ghostly fingers brushed against my back. I dared not turn, for fear of what I might see. In the midst of the chaos, I caught a glimpse of something that sparked both terror and a twisted sense of hope. A staircase that led upward. The steps were slick with condensation and shadows, winding in a spiral that ascended into a faint light above. The voices grew more insistent, but not all of them were hostile. I heard one soft murmur, distinct among the cacophony. "This way. Come home with us." I hesitated, torn between the dread of what lay ahead and the primal desire to escape this eternal detention. Gathering every fragment of courage, I took a step, then another. With every cautious stride upward, the whispers receded into a lower hum, as if the darkness itself was reluctant to follow. The spectral figures behind me faded slightly in the dimness of the hallway, their mournful cries receding like the last notes of a lament. The further I climbed, the more the oppressive atmosphere lifted, replaced by a heavy, stifling quiet. At last I reached a door at the top of the staircase. It was heavy, adorned with rusted metal and long-forgotten scratches that seemed to writhe under my trembling gaze. With trembling hands, I pushed it open. Instead of an exit, I found myself in a long corridor lined with mirrors. In each mirror, I saw not only my own terrified face, but also the faces of dozens of others, strangers, ghosts of students, teachers whose eyes held sorrow and anger. Their expressions were varied. Some begged silently for salvation, others glared with hatred, while still others showed resignation. It was as if the corridor contained the collective soul of the entire school, bound to the mirrors that reflected every lost hope, every moment of regret. I walked slowly down this hall of echoes, each step accompanied by the soft clink of my shoes on cold tile. The mirrors did not merely reflect, they absorbed, morphing the images into grotesque mosaics of face and shadow. Every now and then, a faint whisper would emanate from the glass, a snippet of a memory or an echo of someone's final cry. I could barely piece them together, a laugh here, a sob there, each one a fragment of a life swallowed by the school's unending lament. At the corridor's end was a large, ornate door that looked out of place among the utilitarian architecture of the school. It was carved with delicate floral patterns that, upon closer inspection, resembled twisted, contorted vines. This door pulsed with a faint red glow, and I felt a magnetic pull, as though it were the final link between the world I knew and the abyss that awaited. I hesitated, my heart pounding in my ears. On the other side of that door, the voices seemed to lower to a whisper, as if anticipating my passage. I reached out slowly, my hand shaking uncontrollably, and pushed the door open. A surge of cold, damp air breathed out onto me, carrying the scent of decay and the unmistakable tang of iron. Beyond the door lay a vast room, a grand hall lit by the pale light of a blood-red moon shining through a broken skylight. Rows of desks and chairs were arranged as if for a final class, and at the front of the room, an ancient chalkboard was scrawled with a single message in frantic, jagged script: "We are never free." The sight of it made my skin crawl, and a voice, a soft, almost tender voice, echoed through the room. "Stay with us." I turned sharply, trying to locate the source, but saw only shifting shadows. The desks seemed to vibrate with silent sorrow, and on one chair I could make out a tear-stained journal, the diary of a student whose name had been forgotten long ago. My mind swirled with memories not my own, flashes of classes, of friends laughing and dreaming of the future, now distorted into visions of despair and isolation. The red moon overhead pulsed in time with my racing heart. Suddenly, a cold hand brushed against my shoulder. I jerked around, and in a mirror, I saw a reflection not my own, a gaunt figure with hollow eyes reaching out with a pleading gesture. I staggered back in terror as the figure's lips moved silently, mouthing a word I couldn't decipher. There was no escape now. The room was no sanctuary, but rather the final destination of souls forever trapped. As the clock on the wall, its hands long stuck at the final bell, began to tick once more, the whispers rose into a painful wail. The shadows leapt from the desks and merged with the spectral figure. I could feel their icy fingers tugging at me, pulling me toward the black center of the hall where reality blurred with nightmares. My vision tunneled as everything around dissolved into a maelstrom of anguish and unending despair. In that moment, I realized the horrifying truth. There was no escape. The school had chosen me, as it had chosen countless others before. The cycle of the final day was eternal, a curse renewed with every closing bell, every summer break that ended in bitterness. I felt my will fray, my identity merging with the sorrow of these long-lost souls. My screams were swallowed by the ceaseless din of ghostly lamentations. The final bell tolled again in my mind, a sound so profound it shattered any last vestige of hope, echoing into an endless night. The darkness claimed me slowly. I lost track of time, losing myself in the relentless horror of being part of something far greater and far more dreadful than any life I had known. That auditorium, the corridors, the very walls of St. Bartholomew High, they had become one, and I became part of that ageless gloom. There was no resolution, no escape from this torment. Instead, I was left with a single, whispering truth, echoing eternally. The final day of school was not an end, but a beginning of an endless detention in a place where every bell's toll was a promise that the lost are never free. The red moon's pulse faded, and with it the final vestiges of my former self dissolved into an endless twilight of despair. I existed now only as another whisper, another echo in the halls, bound forever to the school that feasted on lost youth and unfulfilled dreams. The final fuck-up. The final bell rang out across the empty playground as the last day of school faded into an eerie twilight. I stood at the threshold of our old high school, a battered brick building with ivy clawing its way up the walls, and felt a shiver of foreboding that belied the jubilant celebrations expected by nearly every senior. Most of us had long anticipated the freedom that would sweep us away from these halls frozen with memories of laughter, heartbreak, and whispered secrets. But as I stepped through the rusted doors on that bittersweet afternoon, the energy in the air seemed to twist, contorting joy into something darker. It all began as a playful dare among friends. We were gathered in the deserted corridors after the final class had ended, our hearts buzzing with excitement about a night of harmless pranks and a final hurrah before college, and life pulled us in different directions. The hallway lights flickered with an uncertain cadence, and the clamor of our voices echoed off the lockers. But by the time we reached the old auditorium for one last escapade, the atmosphere had already shifted. Inside the auditorium, our laughter subsided as we took in the scene. Dust motes danced sluggishly in the beams of our flashlights, and the seats, once filled with raucous cheers at school plays, sat empty and forlorn beneath a layer of neglect. A chill seeped into the room as one of us dared to whisper that the building sometimes remembers the tragedies of the past, stories of a student who mysteriously vanished decades ago, and the unspeakable events that followed spread like a slow poison. I, like the others, had always dismissed such ghost stories as the fuel for bored imaginations. Yet tonight, with the final day of school weighing upon us like a mark of finality, the old walls began to murmur with secrets. I moved toward the stage, drawn by an inexplicable compulsion. The floorboards groaned underfoot, each step echoing with the sound of lost time. Then, without warning, somewhere behind the heavy velvet curtains, a soft, forlorn melody drifted through the darkness, a tune that carried the sound of a distant, weeping piano. My heart pounded faster as the melody wavered between a lullaby and a dirge, its notes drawing my eyes toward a slit of light seeping through the gap in the curtains. "Guys, did you hear that?" a hushed voice asked from behind me. I turned to see Sarah, famously brave yet now visibly trembling, clutching the arm of her friend. The sound was unmistakable. It was the voice of someone, or something, that had been here long before any of us had trod these corridors. Before we could gather our thoughts, the ringing of the final bell outside shattered the silence momentarily. That metallic chime, meant to celebrate the end of an era, now sounded like a death knell. It reverberated through the empty hallways, each clang a reminder that no matter how much we celebrated, something was unwilling to let go. As we gathered in a tight cluster near the stage, the lights began to flicker unnaturally. Shadows danced in odd internal rhythms that made the auditorium feel alive with a malevolent intelligence. The old portraits hanging along the walls, frozen, smiling faces of past principals, seemed to watch us with eyes full of sorrow and disapproval. I couldn't shake the feeling that we had trespassed on sacred ground, that our unwitting presence had triggered a chain of events long prophesied by the building's haunted history. Suddenly, from the darkness behind the stage, a cold gust of wind extinguished our flashlights, plunging us into near total darkness. Screams erupted as hands, clammy and insubstantial as smoke, brushed against our arms and faces. We fumbled desperately for our phones to light the way, each screen casting a weak glow that barely penetrated the oppressive black. In that fleeting light, I swore I saw a figure, a gaunt, pale outline of a girl with wide, sorrowful eyes, gliding at the edge of the stage. Her expression was one of longing, as if pleading for help that would never come, and in her silent gaze I sensed a tragedy too dreadful for words. "Everyone, stay together," I commanded, my voice trembling more from adrenaline than fear. We gathered in a huddle, the reality of our situation settling like a heavy shroud across our hearts. It wasn't just the pranks or the lingering superstition anymore. It was something far more potent, a presence that inhabited these halls and had awakened with our final day of school. In a moment that seemed suspended between the living and the dead, the sound of measured footsteps echoed toward us. The footsteps were deliberate, slow, and in perfect time with the lost heartbeat of the school itself. We strained to see the source, but the corridor remained an endless stretch of shadow and flickering light. Then the footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by our rapid breaths and the faint, eerie strains of that mournful piano that now seemed to seep through the very walls. Driven by equal parts terror and the desperate need for answers, I led a few of the braver souls, Sarah, whose initial fear gave way to morbid curiosity, John, always the skeptic until now, and Marcus, whose quiet demeanor belied inner fortitude, down a narrow corridor leading to the old library. The library had always been a refuge for us during long study nights, its hush enveloping us in a cocoon of scholarly focus. But now, it was something altogether different, a labyrinth of towering shelves, the scent of must and decaying paper clinging like a tangible miasma. In that dim light, the titles of long-forgotten books seemed to morph into cryptic warnings and sinister incantations. As we ventured deeper, the temperature dropped sharply, and our breaths plumed in the icy air. A solitary desk lamp flickered on a long abandoned table, casting jittery shadows that danced upon the ancient rows of books. I ran my fingers along the spines of volumes untouched for decades, and for a fleeting moment, I felt the burden of countless untold stories pressing upon me. Then, without warning, one of the books, its cover emblazoned with a strange, archaic symbol, fell from its shelf with a thud that echoed like a scream. John picked it up and, with a quivering laugh, said, "Must be one of those moving ghost stories." But his voice faltered as he opened it to reveal pages scrawled with frantic notes and desperate pleas for forgiveness. The words, almost illegible, spoke of an unspeakable event that had occurred on the last day of school many decades ago. A day when a student, tormented by cruelty and despair, had vanished under mysterious circumstances, leaving behind only a promise of vengeance manifested through the halls. The legend had long been dismissed as a tragic myth, but now, as we read the trembling words, a chill of dread settled over us. A sudden, piercing sound, a high-pitched, metallic keening, shattered the quiet. The overhead lights in the library sputtered and died, plunging us into a darkness that was absolute. In that silence, the familiar became terrifyingly alien. The sound of our own footsteps and whispered reassurances faded into the oppressive weight of a presence we could no longer ignore. From the shadows emerged a figure, slinking between the shelves as if propelled by a force we could neither see nor comprehend. The figure was draped in tattered clothing, its face hidden in deep shadow, but as it drew near, we caught a glimpse of eyes that burned with a cold, unholy light. There was something in its slow, deliberate gait, a mix of sorrow and malevolence, that transformed it from simply a ghostly apparition to an embodiment of the school's darkest memories. "Leave. Leave now," the figure hissed in a voice that was both annunciation and warning, echoing around us in distorted timbre. Its words reverberated in the silence, and in that moment, every horror movie cliché we'd ever scoffed at surged to life. We tried to run, scattering in every direction, but the corridors twisted and turned in labyrinthine patterns, as though the very building were disassembling to trap us within its malignant heart. I found myself alone in a narrow stairwell, the sound of our panicked shouts muffled by the oppressive darkness. My heart thundered in my ears as I scrambled up the creaking steps, each one moving under my weight as if possessed. The air was thick with the scent of old paper and decay, mixed with an acrid odor I could not place, a fetid reminder of something long dead and equally unforgiving. At the top of the staircase, I burst into the main corridor where the final bell still echoed in the distance, a relic of the day's last lesson. There, in the ghostly glow of the departing day, I saw the figure again. The spectral presence that had haunted the library now stood silently at the far end of the hall. Its eyes, luminous and unblinking, fixed upon me as the sound of that final bell reverberated like a dirge. In that charged instant, everything around me slowed. The voices, the light, my own ragged breaths, until all that remained was the terrible truth. Some endings are not meant to be celebrated, but mourned. With a final, soul-crushing scream that seemed to tear through the fabric of the night, the figure raised an ethereal hand. A cascade of shimmering, spectral energy poured forth, enveloping the corridor and drawing me toward the void at its center. I struggled, every fiber of my being fighting to resist, but the force was inexorable, reminding me that the final day of school was not simply an end, but the beginning of a legacy born of heartbreak and vengeance. Then, as the spectral energy closed in around me, the final bell tolled one last time. The sound, echoing with finality and irrevocable sorrow, marked not the end of our school year, but the sealing of an ancient curse. The corridors fell silent, the spectral presence receding like a bad dream, leaving behind only a cold emptiness and the lingering taste of despair. I awoke hours later, sprawled upon the damp, cold steps of the school entrance. The building was as silent and still as before, yet something had changed irrevocably. My friends were there, dazed and trembling, with broken fragments of memories we could barely piece together, voices in the dark, strange symbols scrawled in dust along the walls, and a sense of overwhelming sorrow that clawed at the edges of our hearts. The final bell had rung, and while we returned to our homes with relief that the nightmare was over, a lingering dread remained, a haunting certainty that the horrors of that day were not confined to the final moments of school, but would forever echo in the empty halls and in the depths of our souls. I now sit in silence on quiet nights. The memory of that final bell and the dread it once heralded a constant companion. Every creak of wood and every whisper of wind is a reminder that some curses are never fully lifted, that the darkest horrors often hide in the places we least expect, waiting patiently for the next final day to reawaken. The locker that never opened. The last day of school was supposed to be a celebration. The air was thick with the scent of summer freedom, and the halls buzzed with the chaotic energy of students eager to escape. But for me, it was different. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that the school itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. It started with the locker. Locker 329, to be exact. It had been there for as long as anyone could remember, tucked away at the far end of the east wing, where the fluorescent lights always seemed to flicker. No one used it. No one even touched it. The rumor was that it had belonged to a student who disappeared decades ago, leaving behind nothing but whispers and a faint, lingering unease. I never believed the stories. They were just the kind of urban legends that high school kids loved to pass around, like the one about the janitor who supposedly lived in the basement, or the ghost of the girl who drowned in the pool. But on that last day, as I walked past locker 329 on my way to the senior assembly, I felt something. A pull. A cold, invisible hand brushing against my arm, urging me to stop. I hesitated, my heart pounding in my chest. The hallway was empty, the distant hum of voices from the gymnasium muffled by the thick walls. The locker stood there, silent and unassuming, its metal surface dull and scratched. I told myself it was nothing, just my imagination running wild. But as I turned to walk away, I heard it. A faint, rhythmic tapping, like fingernails drumming against the inside of the door. I froze. The sound was so soft, so subtle, that I almost convinced myself I hadn't heard it at all. But then it came again, louder this time, more insistent. My breath caught in my throat as I stepped closer, my hand trembling as I reached out to touch the cold metal. "Don't," a voice said behind me, sharp and urgent. I spun around to see Emily, my best friend, standing a few feet away, her face pale and her eyes wide with fear. "What are you doing here?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "I could ask you the same thing," she said, glancing nervously at the locker. "You shouldn't be near that thing. No one should." "It's just a locker," I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. "It's not like it's cursed or anything." Emily shook her head. "You don't understand. My mom went to this school. She told me about it. About the kid who disappeared. They never found him, but they found his locker open. And inside..." She trailed off, her voice trembling. "And inside what?" I pressed, my curiosity outweighing my fear. Emily hesitated, then whispered, "Blood. Lots of it. Like something had dragged him in." I laughed nervously, trying to shake off the chill that ran down my spine. "Come on, Emily. That's just a story. There's no way." The locker rattled. We both jumped, our eyes snapping to the door as it shuddered violently, the sound echoing through the empty hallway. My heart raced as I grabbed Emily's arm, pulling her back. "Let's get out of here," I said, my voice shaking. But before we could move, the locker stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, pressing down on us like a weight. And then, slowly, the door creaked open. The air grew colder, the fluorescent lights flickering wildly as a dark, viscous liquid began to seep out from the locker's interior, pooling on the floor. The smell hit us next, metallic and rancid, like rust and decay. Emily gagged, covering her mouth with her hand, while I stood frozen, unable to look away. Inside the locker there was nothing. No books, no papers, no forgotten gym clothes, just darkness. A deep, impenetrable void that seemed to stretch on forever. And from that void came a sound, a low, guttural growl that sent shivers down my spine. "Run!" Emily whispered, her voice barely audible. But I couldn't move. My feet felt rooted to the ground, my body paralyzed by fear. The growl grew louder, more menacing, as a shape began to emerge from the darkness. It was humanoid, but wrong. Its limbs too long, its movements jerky and unnatural. Its eyes glowed a sickly yellow, and its mouth twisted into a grotesque grin, revealing rows of jagged, blackened teeth. Emily screamed, snapping me out of my trance. I grabbed her hand, and we ran, our footsteps echoing through the empty halls as the creature crawled out of the locker, its claws scraping against the tile floor. We burst into the gymnasium, where the senior assembly was in full swing. The noise and light were a stark contrast to the darkness we had just escaped, and for a moment, I thought we were safe. But then the lights flickered, and the creature was there, standing in the doorway, its twisted form silhouetted against the dim glow. The students fell silent, their laughter and chatter replaced by a collective gasp of horror. The creature let out a deafening roar, its voice a cacophony of pain and rage, and the gymnasium descended into chaos. People screamed and scrambled for the exits. But the creature was fast, too fast. It moved with an unnatural speed, its claws slashing through the air as it tore through the crowd. Blood splattered across the walls, the floor, the bleachers, as the creature unleashed its fury on anyone in its path. Emily and I ducked under the bleachers, our hearts pounding as we watched the carnage unfold. I could feel her trembling beside me, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. "We have to do something," I whispered, though I had no idea what. "What can we do?" Emily hissed back. "That thing isn't human. It's not even real." I glanced around, my mind racing. There had to be a way to stop it, to send it back to whatever hell it had come from. And then I remembered the locker. "It came from the locker," I said, my voice trembling. Maybe we can trap it back inside." Emily stared at me like I'd lost my mind. "Are you insane? How are we supposed to do that?" "I don't know," I admitted, "but we have to try." Before she could argue, I crawled out from under the bleachers, my legs shaking as I stood. The creature was still rampaging through the gym, its claws tearing through flesh and bone with sickening ease. I took a deep breath, steeling myself, and shouted, "Hey! Over here!" The creature stopped, its glowing eyes snapping to me. It let out a low growl, its twisted grin widening as it began to stalk toward me. My heart felt like it might burst out of my chest, but I forced myself to stand my ground. "Come on," I muttered under my breath. "Come and get me." The creature lunged, and I turned and ran, leading it back through the hallways toward the east wing. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but I didn't stop. I could hear its claws scraping against the floor behind me, its growls growing louder with each passing second. Finally, I reached the locker. It stood there, its door still ajar, the darkness inside pulsing like a living thing. I skidded to a stop, turning to face the creature as it closed in. "Come on," I whispered, my voice trembling. "Just a little closer." The creature lunged again, its claws outstretched, and I dove to the side at the last second. It crashed into the locker, its twisted form disappearing into the void. The door slammed shut with a deafening clang, and the hallway fell silent. I lay there for a moment, gasping for breath, before crawling to my feet. The locker was still, its surface cold and unyielding. Whatever had been unleashed was back where it belonged. Emily found me a few minutes later, her face pale and streaked with tears. Is it over?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, though I wasn't entirely sure. The locker was closed, but the darkness inside still lingered, a silent reminder of the horrors we had faced. We left the school that night, vowing never to speak of what had happened, but even now, years later, I can still hear the faint tapping from locker 329, a chilling reminder that some doors should never be opened. Since then, I can't go near school. It began as the most ordinary day one could imagine, the last day of school. The halls were filled with a mix of bittersweet laughter and nervous excitement about summer freedom and the end of an era. For many, it was a day of celebration. For me, it had always carried an undercurrent of dread. I was Jack Rutledge, a senior who had seen too much change over these 4 long years, and as the final bell approached, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong with the very foundations of our old high school. I arrived at school early that morning. The building, a weathered brick structure with ivy creeping over its walls, seemed to slumber under a pale, overcast sky. The corridors, lit by weak fluorescent lights, echoed with the familiar sound of my footsteps, but there was an odd stillness, as if the air itself was holding its breath. Rumors had long circulated among the seniors about the old wing of the school, once rumored to be haunted ever since a tragedy decades ago. It was said that on the final day, if you dared stray from the safe, crowded areas, you might glimpse shadows of those who had suffered and lost their last moments there. I wasn't sure if these were simple legends built from teenage imagination, but today, when everything should have felt jubilant and light, an inexplicable chill ran down my spine. Some of my friends, Emily, Troy, and Lisa, whispered nervously about strange sounds that they'd heard the previous night, muffled sobs in empty classrooms, echoing footsteps in deserted hallways, and the unmistakable toll of a bell long silenced. We agreed, in hushed tones, to check out the old wing together after classes ended. We told ourselves it was just a dare, a way to make the last day more thrilling. Yet, a whisper of foreboding accompanied our plans. The school day passed in an uneasy blur. In class, teachers tried to recite the lessons one last time, but even the sound of chalk on blackboards felt distorted, as if the room were absorbing every word and turning it into nothing. In the cafeteria, laughter mingled with secretive glances, and no one mentioned the rumors. By the time the final period ended, the heavy weight of anticipation had settled into our bones. After last bell rang, its sound echoing mournfully down the empty hall, I and my friends gathered near the entrance to the old wing. The door, usually locked for years, stood slightly ajar, as if inviting us inside. With a shared nod and hearts pounding in unison, we slipped through. Inside, the air was stale and cold. The corridor stretched before us with peeling paint and faded photographs of long-forgotten school events. The silence was profound, broken only by the soft scuffing of our shoes on cracked linoleum. I could almost feel the anguish of the past, as if the walls themselves mourned a tragedy that had never been laid to rest. In one classroom, a blackboard bore half-erased words in smudged chalk. "Don't forget." The message was unfinished, a haunting reminder that some lessons never truly end. We moved cautiously down the hall, each step accompanied by the creak of ancient floorboards that seemed to groan under our weight. Emily's small hand trembled as she clutched her phone, its screen illuminating the dark corners as if trying to reveal secrets. Troy joked weakly to mask his own dread, but his eyes told another story, one of uncertainty and deep-rooted fear. Lisa led the way, her usual confidence replaced by a quiet determination to prove that the rumors were nothing more than stories. Yet even she couldn't hide the way her lips quivered when a cold draft swept unexpectedly from a darkened doorway. At the end of the corridor, a staircase spiraled upward toward what used to be the auditorium, a place where once laughter and applause filled the air. Now its door hung open, and a faint rhythmic sound seeped out from within. We paused. That sound. It wasn't the echo of our own nervous whispers. It was like the toll of a bell, deep, mournful, and strangely insistent. We exchanged looks, and in that silent moment, a decision formed among us: to follow the sound. Climbing the narrow stairs, every step took us deeper into a part of the school we rarely visited. The air grew colder, and the lights flickered erratically, as if struggling to hold off an unseen force. The rhythmic toll grew louder, reverberating in our chests and sending shivers down our spines. At the top of the stairs, a long hallway led to the auditorium. The door at the far end swung slightly, as if pushed by an invisible hand. Summoning all our courage, we approached. Inside, the auditorium was shrouded in half-light. Rows of seats faced a grand stage where curtains, once vibrant and alive with color, now hung tattered and pallid. The source of the bell sound revealed itself. It came from a large clock mounted on the back wall, its hands frozen at an impossible time, exactly 3:33, and its bell swinging slowly as if in an eternal toll. But no one was near. The clock rang without cause, each toll a hollow sound that filled the room with despair. I stepped forward to examine it. The metal of the clock was cold and covered in a film of dust, yet beneath that layer of neglect, the surface was inscribed with tiny, almost illegible words. As I leaned in, my eyes caught a message that made my blood run cold. Once the final bell tolls, the past refuses to die. I jerked back, the weight of those words settling heavily on my heart. My mind raced with possible meanings. Could it be that the school held secrets too terrible to be forgotten? As if the spirits of all who had suffered within these walls were now trying to reach out. A sudden sound, a faint scraping along the side of the stage, drew our attention. We turned toward the noise, and in the dim light, I saw a figure near the edge of the stage. At first, it was just a shadow, but as it moved, the form became clearer. A young student, perhaps not much older than ourselves, with eyes that were wide and unseeing. The figure's clothes were ragged, as if torn by years of neglect, and its face was pale in the ghostly light. It wandered slowly, as if trapped in a loop, its gaze fixed on something beyond our sight. "Did you see that?" whispered Troy, his voice trembling. We nodded in unison, a mixture of fear and fascination keeping us rooted to the spot. The figure moved toward the front, and as it did, a chill swept over the room. The clock on the wall began to chime again, each toll louder and more resonant than before. With every chime, the figure paused momentarily, as if in reaction. The apparition suddenly turned and stared straight at us with eyes that held unimaginable sorrow. For a long, agonizing second, time stood still. Then, with a quiet, shuddering moan, it vanished, dissolving into an ethereal mist that drifted slowly across the stage. The sound of the bell faded into a hollow, echoing silence, and the auditorium plunged back into darkness. We fled the auditorium in a state of panic and disbelief. Our minds reeled as we clutched each other and raced down the hall, back through the old wing, back down the stairs, until we burst out onto the chilly afternoon air. Outside, the world appeared normal. Students gathered in clusters, laughter echoing in the quad, oblivious to the spectral terror we had witnessed. But for us, nothing would ever be the same. In the days that followed, the memory of that final day haunted our every moment. I couldn't shake the image of the ghostly student, nor the sound of that relentless, sorrowful bell. The school, once a place of carefree joy and routine, had become a vessel of endless torment, a repository of secrets that the past refused to die. Late at night, when everything was quiet, I would walk the empty halls alone, half expecting to hear the final toll echo through the corridors, or catch a glimpse of that sorrowful face in a darkened window. No one could explain what happened in that old wing. The clock that chimed for no reason, the spectral figure bound by regret, the inexplicable inscription that hinted at a burden the school had carried for decades. Rumors began to spread, whispered among students and staff alike, growing with each telling until the legend took on a life of its own. Some said that forgiving the past was the only way to lift the curse, while others whispered of rituals and forbidden knowledge meant to put the dead to rest. But no one dared to try, for fear of awakening forces best left undisturbed. I left that school as soon as graduation came, a near escape from a place where every hallway and classroom held echoes of unsolved tragedies. Yet, the memory never faded. In the quiet of my own home, I sometimes hear that single mournful chime of the final bell, a reminder that some secrets and some sorrows live on long after we leave the place where they were born. He broke my spirit. I was the last one left. The final bell had long since faded into memory, or so everyone thought, when I found myself wandering the empty corridors of Oak Ridge High on that last day of school. The rest of the students had flown out the doors in a manic rush towards summer freedom, leaving the building abandoned like a carcass. But I couldn't leave. Something deep inside urged me to stay, to bear witness to the farewell that the school itself was silently enacting. I remember the moment clearly. The final bell rang, a bell whose sound on that day wasn't jubilant or freeing. It was a mournful toll that echoed down the empty hallways. The sound faded into a lingering vibration that seemed to pulse with a dark intent. My heart pounded as I stood still on the cracked linoleum floor of the main lobby. An inexplicable chill gripped me, sending shivers up my spine. I didn't recall a single other soul, only my own ragged breathing and the eventual disconcerting silence that followed in the wake of that bell. I had always known Oak Ridge High to be an aging building, one with creaky floors and narrow hallways that twisted and turned with a peculiar charm. But on that final day, the building felt entirely different, as if the many years of laughter, tears, triumphs, and disappointments had congealed into something malevolent. The familiar sights, the rows of locked classroom doors, the scuffed lockers lining the walls, even the old trophy case in the foyer, seemed to pulse with an eerie life. Something unspeakable stirred behind the worn paint and dusty windows. I started walking. My footsteps echoed as I moved slowly through the silent corridors, each step accompanied by a growing sense of dread. I passed by classrooms where desks lay in disarray. Chalk scribbles faded into the smudges on the boards. In the art room, canvases that once burst with bright colors now appeared bleak, their hues darkened to bruised purples and sickly greens that gave the impression of agony. It was as if the vibrant memories of countless students had been drained away, leaving only sorrow behind. As I drifted toward the auditorium, a place that had always been the heart of school celebrations and farewell assemblies, I began to notice subtle, inexplicable changes. The hallway lights, normally a steady glow, flickered in uneven pulses, and in their brief quiet moments, shadows danced along the walls in forms that resembled the fleeting silhouettes of children darting across the courtyard. I could almost swear that those ghostly shapes were the long-lost echoes of students who had once roamed these halls, trapped forever in the final moments of their school days. Approaching the auditorium door, I hesitated. The heavy oak door was slightly ajar, its surface weathered and scratched by decades of use. A thin sliver of darkness beckoned me inside. I pushed the door open slowly, and a gust of cold air rushed out, carrying with it a faint, distant sound. A whisper, almost inaudible, as if someone was softly calling my name. My breath caught and my heart thumped painfully in my chest. Inside the auditorium was draped in heavy shadows. Rows of seats sat in silent formation, many of them overturned or left scattered in a rushed exodus. The stage was shrouded in darkness, but as I stepped closer, I saw that what lay there was not an empty space, but a tableau of eerie stillness. A solitary desk with a flickering lamp, a dusty microphone stand, and faded posters of past school plays. They were all arranged precisely, as if in preparation for one final performance. And in the dim light that filtered through the cracked windows, I noticed a message chalked across the stage. "Stay and remember." The words sent a shudder through me. I could feel an oppressive weight in the air, as though the building itself were aware of my every step. I took a seat in the middle row, the metal of the chair cold against my skin. I sat there, overwhelmed by a profound loneliness and a creeping realization that this place had secrets beyond any sneeze of nostalgia. Hours passed in what felt like a suspended moment of time. I heard my own breathing, the faint tick of an ancient clock somewhere in the building, and then, gradually, I began to hear them, the whispers. At first they were soft, almost imperceptible, like the distant rustling of leaves on a winter's day. But as the silence deepened, the voices grew clearer. They were disjointed murmurings, snippets of conversations from years long past. Laughter, cries, pleas, and secrets uttered at the final moments of school life. I couldn't understand them fully. They were fragments of joy and sorrow, memories of lives that had once been full. But they filled me with a sense of overwhelming despair. I rose from my seat and began to wander again, compelled to follow the sound of those voices. They led me down a corridor lined with old, abandoned classrooms. In one room, I found remnants of a science fair, shattered trophies, incomplete projects, and overgrown plants that had seemingly reclaimed the space. A classroom projector flickered to life briefly on its own, casting warped images onto a peeling wall, images that seemed to depict past events. Hidden moments of student life turned surreal and nightmarish. Faces of children and teachers emerged and then dissolved, leaving behind a bitter taste of regret and unshed tears. In another classroom, the blackboard bore new, frantic writing scrawled in a shaky hand. "We were here. We never left. Don't forget." The words were accompanied by hurried sketches of eerie figures and contorted shapes that defied logic. I felt a chill seep into my bones as the echo of that message reverberated through the silence. The overwhelming sense of being watched made my skin crawl. Outside, the day wore on. The light of the setting sun bled through the dusty windows, painting the halls in a twilight of deep oranges and blood reds. The school transformed, as if the dying day unearthed its inner demons. Shadows lengthened into grotesque forms, and the temperature seemed to plummet, so that my breath became visible in the dimming light. I sensed that time was running out, that the spell of remembrance was at its peak, and with it, the school's hidden horror would fully awaken. I made my way to the staircase that led to the upper floors I'd rarely visited, and ascended slowly. The stairs themselves were steep and narrow, and each step creaked under my weight. The walls were covered in ghosts of graffiti, names and symbols scrawled decades ago here and there, each a silent testament to lost friendships and broken hearts. I paused by one particular inscription: "Forever is not enough." The words pulsed, almost vibrationally, as if imbued with the same sorrow that now resided in every corner of the building. Reaching the second floor, I found the corridors even more disturbed. The lockers, once a vibrant palette of student adornments, now stood open and empty. Instead of belongings, haphazard collages of old photographs, faded yearbook pages, and handfuls of lost letters were strewn about. I picked up one of the pages. It was a photo of a group of friends, their smiles bright and optimistic. Underneath, in spidery penmanship, someone had written, "We will be together when the final bell tolls." I shivered, the message both sweet and deeply tragic. The oppressive atmosphere pressed in on me as I proceeded toward the central administrative wing, a section of the school I had never truly seen, but which now loomed as a monolithic structure at the heart of this haunted edifice. The main office was dark, the curtains drawn, and the familiar desk was cluttered with old memos and cryptic notes. A single envelope lay on the desk, its paper yellowed and brittle with age. I opened it with trembling fingers. Inside was a letter addressed generically to "The Last of Us," dated over 20 years ago. The message within was a plea, a desperate appeal to remember, to hold on to who we once were. It ended with a single chilling line: "When the final recess ends, the living must join us in perpetual dismissal." A sudden loud crash echoed from somewhere deep in the building, a sound like shattering glass intermingled with anguished cries. I dropped the letter, my heart racing. The moment felt as if the veil between the past and present had been torn apart. The corridors began to shake, and I ran, driven by equal parts terror and the urge to escape this cursed place. I found myself back in the main lobby, which now appeared transformed into a grand, nightmarish hall. The ceiling towered impossibly high, its beams twisting like skeletal hands reaching toward the heavens. The floor, once flat and welcoming, was uneven and covered in a thin layer of dust mixed with ghostly footprints that led to a massive door at the back of the lobby. The door was ornate, its wood darkened and carved with twisted motifs of eyes and mouths, as if it were the very portal to another world. I approached the door slowly, each heartbeat echoing like a drum. The ghosts of the past seemed to close in around me, their faces contorted with endless grief and longing. I could barely make out hushed conversations, the sound of farewell, of promises broken and hearts left behind. With a trembling hand, I pushed the door open. Beyond lay a narrow, descending staircase, lit by a faint, unnatural glow. The air was cold and heavy with the smell of damp earth and decay. I realized with dawning horror that this staircase led to the basement, the part of the school that had been buried in rumor and secrecy. It was said that decades ago, something terrible had happened down there, something that the school had locked away in darkness, and now it was calling. I took a deep breath and descended. The steps creaked beneath me, each one a reminder of how unwelcome I was in this realm. At the bottom, I entered a vast subterranean hall, a place that seemed to merge the forgotten basement of a school with the ruins of an ancient crypt. Dim light filtered in from a single window near the ceiling, casting eerie patterns across rows of old, rusted lockers and abandoned storage rooms. Among the scattered debris, I saw remnants of old school records, photographs, and diaries, the very evidence of lives once lived. And then I heard it, a sound that stopped me in my tracks. A soft, rhythmic tapping echoed from one of the storage rooms. It was deliberate, measured, and carried with it a sense of inexorable finality. My pulse quickened. I crept toward the sound, each step hesitant but driven by a compulsion I could neither understand nor resist. The door to the storage room creaked open, revealing a room shrouded in shadows. In the center of the room was an old, dented locker that pulsed with a faint, sickly light. The tapping was coming from within. I approached slowly, my heart pounding in my ears, and reached out to open the locker door. It swung open with ease, revealing nothing but a swirling mass of darkness that seemed to pull at my very soul, a void that stretched beyond comprehension. In that moment, countless whispers erupted from the darkness. They spoke of sorrow, of isolation, of lives cut short, and memories lost. The voices were layered upon one another, an endless dirge that seemed to weave itself into the fabric of my mind. I stood frozen, unable to tear my eyes away from the void as its darkness began to seep upward, crawling along the floor and walls like living ink. The tapping resumed, louder now. I realized that the sound wasn't random. It was the beat of a heart, an ancient, relentless rhythm that had been buried beneath years of neglect and sorrow. My eyes widened as the void pulsed in time with that beat. Suddenly, from the center of the swirling darkness, a hand emerged, a skeletal, ghostly hand reaching out for me. Frost bit at my skin as the hand moved jerkily, as if trying to grasp something beyond its reach. I stumbled backward, terror surging through me. The hand's appearance was accompanied by a shockwave of cold air, and the locker door slammed shut on its own accord. For a brief, heart-stopping moment, everything went silent. Then, the voices rose in a haunting crescendo. The tapping evolved into a cacophonous clamor, echoing off the concrete walls and resonating through every fiber of my being. I knew then, with horrifying clarity, that I was marked, forever bound to the curse of this forsaken building. The last recess, the final dismissal, was not merely the end of a school day, but a ritual, a summoning of the lost, an awakening of the pain embedded in every corner of Oak Ridge High. In that endless darkness, as whispers merged with the pounding of an unseen heart and the specters of the past encroached upon me, I realized there was no escape. I was to become one with these halls, another voice in the eternal lament of lost youth. As I backed away, I caught one final glimpse of a reflection in a shattered mirror, a face contorted in perpetual sorrow, eyes hollow, and a silent scream frozen on my lips. The door behind me slammed shut, drowning my final plea in an avalanche of despair. There was no salvation, no rescue, only the relentless certainty that this last day of school would echo on forever, a perpetual detention for those damned to never leave. And in that moment, as darkness claimed me entirely, I understood. Oak Ridge High did not release its students at the end of the day. Instead, it imprisoned them, binding them to a fate of eternal, unyielding horror, an everlasting recess where every bell toll echoed the lament of a broken spirit. Even now, years later, when I pass by the old school building, its windows dark and silent, I feel a cold shiver. I wonder if on that last day, in that final moment, the dead kept their promise, that someday, on the last day of school, the final bell would toll again, to claim another generation unaware of the horror that lies beneath the surface. And in that thought, a profound dread settles over me, a reminder that the past, no matter how deeply we bury it, never truly dies. The Blood Prom. The last day of school was supposed to be a celebration, a night of glittering dresses, cheap tuxedos, and the bittersweet promise of goodbyes. For the seniors of Black Hollow High, prom was the final chapter in a story of friendships, rivalries, and fleeting romances. But for me, it was something else entirely. It was a night I had been dreading for weeks, ever since the whispers began. It started with the invitations. They arrived in blood-red envelopes, slipped into lockers overnight. No one knew who had sent them. Not the teachers, not the principal, not even the student council. The invitations were simple. A single card with the words, "You are cordially invited to the Blood Prom," scrawled in elegant looping handwriting. At first, everyone thought it was a prank, a clever marketing gimmick to make this year's prom unforgettable. But as the days passed, the unease grew. The venue was the old Black Hollow Manor, a crumbling estate on the outskirts of town. It had been abandoned for decades, its windows shattered and its walls covered in ivy. The stories about the manor were as old as the town itself. Tales of disappearances, of strange lights flickering in the windows at night, of screams that echoed through the woods. No one in their right mind would have chosen it for a prom venue. But the invitations were clear, and the excitement of something forbidden was too much for most of the students to resist. By the time the sun set on the last day of school, the entire senior class was gathered at the gates of the manor. The air was thick with anticipation and the faint scent of decay. The gates creaked open on their own, revealing a long, overgrown path leading to the house. The students laughed nervously, their chatter masking the growing sense of dread. I hung back, my stomach churning as I watched them disappear into the darkness. "Come on, Lily," my best friend Mia said, grabbing my arm. "It's just a party. What's the worst that could happen?" I wanted to tell her about the dreams I'd been having, the visions of blood-soaked floors and shadowy figures lurking in the corners. But I didn't. I couldn't. Instead, I forced a smile and followed her through the gates. The manor was even more imposing up close. Its towering spires loomed against the night sky, and the windows glowed with an unnatural red light. Inside, the air was heavy and cold, carrying the faint metallic tang of blood. The grand ballroom had been transformed into a macabre wonderland, with chandeliers dripping with crimson wax and tables adorned with black roses. A haunting melody played from an unseen source, its notes echoing through the cavernous space. The students were already dancing, their laughter and cheers filling the room. But something was wrong. Their movements were jerky, almost mechanical, and their faces were pale and expressionless. It was as if they were puppets, their strings pulled by an unseen hand. Mia and I stood at the edge of the dance floor watching in uneasy silence. "This is weird," she said, her voice barely audible over the music. Before I could respond, the lights flickered, and the room fell silent. The music stopped, and the students froze in place, their heads snapping toward the grand staircase at the far end of the room. A figure stood at the top of the stairs, cloaked in shadows. It was tall and thin, its face obscured by a mask that gleamed like polished bone. "Welcome," the figure said, its voice smooth and cold, "to the blood prom." The students erupted into cheers, their voices echoing through the ballroom. But Mia and I didn't move. We couldn't. The figure's gaze swept over the crowd, and I felt its eyes linger on me, piercing through the darkness. "You have all been chosen," it continued, descending the stairs with an unnatural grace. "Tonight, we celebrate not just the end of your school years, but the beginning of something far greater." The figure reached the center of the room and raised its arms. The chandeliers flared to life, casting the room in a blood-red glow. The students began to move again, their laughter and cheers growing louder as they danced with a frenzied energy. But their movements were wrong, too fast, too erratic, as if they were being controlled by some unseen force. Mia grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "We need to get out of here," she whispered, her voice trembling. I nodded, my heart pounding as we edged toward the door. But before we could reach it, the figure's voice rang out again. "No one leaves," it said, its tone sharp and commanding. The doors slammed shut, and the room plunged into darkness. Panic erupted. Students screamed and clawed at the doors, but they wouldn't budge. The figure laughed, a cold, hollow sound that sent shivers down my spine. "You cannot escape," it said. "The blood prom is eternal." The chandeliers flared again, revealing the true horror of the ballroom. The students' faces were twisted into grotesque masks of pain and terror, their eyes empty and lifeless. Blood dripped from their mouths and hands, pooling on the floor. The walls were covered in crimson streaks, and the air was thick with the stench of death. Mia and I clung to each other, our breaths coming in short, panicked gasps. The figure turned toward us, its mask gleaming in the red light. "You," it said, pointing a long, bony finger at me. "You are the key." I shook my head, my mind racing. "I don't understand," I stammered. The figure stepped closer, its movements slow and deliberate. "You were chosen," it said, "to complete the ritual." Mia stepped in front of me, her voice shaking with anger. "Leave her alone." The figure tilted its head as if amused. "Brave," it said, "but foolish." With a wave of its hand, Mia was thrown across the room, her body slamming into the wall with a sickening thud. I screamed, running to her side, but she didn't move. Her eyes stared blankly ahead, her chest still. "No," I cried, tears streaming down my face. The figure loomed over me, its shadow swallowing the light. "The ritual must be completed," it said. "You cannot resist." I scrambled to my feet, my mind racing. I didn't know what the ritual was or why I had been chosen, but I knew one thing. I wasn't going to let it win. I grabbed a candelabra from a nearby table and swung it at the figure with all my strength. It shattered against its chest, but the figure didn't flinch. Instead, it laughed, a deep, guttural sound that echoed through the room. "You cannot fight me," it said. "I am eternal." But I didn't stop. I grabbed anything I could find, chairs, vases, even a broken piece of wood, and hurled them at the figure. It dodged each one with ease, its movements fluid and inhuman. "You are wasting your time," it said, its voice dripping with disdain. But then I saw it, a crack in the mask, a faint line that glowed with an otherworldly light. I didn't know what it meant, but I knew it was my only chance. I lunged at the figure, my hands clawing at the mask. It fought back, its claws raking across my arms and face, but I didn't let go. With a final desperate scream, I tore the mask from its face. The figure let out a deafening roar, its body convulsing as the light consumed it. The room shook violently, the walls cracking and the chandeliers crashing to the floor. The students collapsed, their bodies limp and lifeless. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. The figure was gone, the ballroom silent and still. I stumbled to my feet, my body aching and my vision blurred. Mia lay motionless on the floor, her face pale and her eyes closed. I knelt beside her, my hands trembling as I shook her shoulders. "Mia," I whispered, "please wake up." Her eyes fluttered open and she let out a weak groan. "Lily?" she said, her voice barely audible. I pulled her into a tight embrace, tears streaming down my face. "It's over," I said. "It's finally over." But as I looked around the ruined ballroom, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't. The blood prom was over, but the darkness that had consumed it still lingered, waiting for its next chance to rise. The Last Whisper. It began on what everyone in our town called the final day, the last day of school, a day that should have been filled with carefree promise and relief. Instead, from the very first bell, a silent dread crept into the corridors of Ashbury High. I, Sarah McKinley, a senior with a penchant for quiet observation, sensed early that something was profoundly wrong. That morning, the sky hung heavy and low, as if mourning the impending end. The building itself, a time-worn structure with red brick and dark mossy corners, seemed to exude a sorrowful aura. As students milled about chattering about summer plans, I felt an inexplicable chill down my spine. It was as though the hallways whispered secrets among themselves, murmuring hints of untold tragedies. In homeroom, Mrs. Dell, our kind but reserved teacher, tried to usher us into a final lesson. But even her warm smile was marred by a pained look in her eyes, a furtive glance toward the locked door of the old wing, a part of the school that had been abandoned after a series of unspeakable events decades ago. Rumors swirled among the seniors about this wing, tales passed down through hushed voices, that on the last day, the past refused to rest, and that horrific echoes from that forgotten era would rise to claim the living. As dismissal bell finally rang, a collective sigh swept through the student body, followed by a spontaneous burst of celebratory noise. But I, along with a small group of close friends, Ethan, Mira, and Jordan, felt compelled to uncover the truth. We decided to venture into the old wing, emboldened by equal parts curiosity and an unspoken need to confront the source of this oppressive energy. It was, after all, our last day. If we were to believe the legends, fate demanded we witness it firsthand. With trembling hands and smartphones clutched like talismans, we slipped away across empty corridors toward the ancient barred door. The metal was cold, and when Mira touched it, a shiver ran through her. We managed to pry the door open just enough to slip into the darkness beyond. Inside, the air was thick with dust and a palpable sense of anguish. Faded murals and peeling paint revealed glimpses of happier times, a long-ago era of laughter and promise overshadowed by a lingering tragedy. As we moved carefully down the narrow corridor, the muffled echoes of our footsteps were swallowed by a thicker silence. There, on one cracked wall, we discovered smeared in faded chalk a single haunting message. "Remember the lost. They cry still." The words, barely legible, sent our hearts pounding. We exchanged nervous looks. Ethan's eyes darted to the darkened corners as if expecting them to speak. We pressed further until we reached a series of classrooms left untouched for years. One room in particular drew us, a space that seemed larger than the others, with a battered blackboard and rows of desks scattered haphazardly. Beneath the blackboard's remnants, we discovered old photographs of students from a time long gone. Their faces were partly blurred by age, yet in every picture their eyes bore a haunting emptiness, a void that seemed to cry from beyond. A chill clutched our hearts, and Jordan's voice trembled as he whispered, "What happened here?" The silence was answered only by the distant, barely audible sound of a bell. It was not the cheerful ringing of the final bell we'd heard earlier, but something deeper, a toll that resonated as if far from here, echoing from the very foundations of the school. The sound grew louder, more insistent, and we felt compelled to follow it. We retraced our steps deeper into the old wing until we reached a long-forgotten staircase that led down into the basement. The steps creaked under our weight, each groan echoing in the gloom like a cry of warning. The further we descended, the colder it grew, until even our breath seemed to freeze in the chill. At the bottom, there was a door, slightly ajar, behind which a faint light flickered. We pushed it open, and before us lay a vast, cavernous space, a hidden auditorium that had once served as a gathering place for secret school events. Now, it was a mausoleum of memories. In the center of this grim hall stood an ancient clock, its face shattered, its hands frozen at 3:33. Yet every few moments, a ghostly chime would sound, resonating as if the clock itself mourned. The chimes grew in volume and cadence until they drowned out all other sound. In the eerie glow of a single dangling light bulb, we saw something impossible. Silhouettes of students, translucent and sorrowful, drifting among the rows of seats. Their eyes were hollow, their mouths open in silent screams. They moved slowly, almost methodically, as if retracing motions from a final, long-forgotten day. Panic surged through us. Ethan grabbed my arm, stuttering, "We shouldn't be here. We need to get out, now." But as we turned to retreat, a low, sorrowful whisper filled the room. It was not a single voice, but a chorus of longing and grief, repeating a single, undying refrain. "Stay, remember, return." The word return struck me as both a command and a plea. Our hearts battled between fleeing and understanding. The lure of the past was too potent. We needed to know what bound these lost souls to this place. Mira stepped forward, her eyes glistening with a determination that belied her fear. "There's something here," she said softly. "Something they want us to see." With that, she moved to the front of the auditorium, reaching out toward one of the ghostly figures. As she did, the chimes escalated into a terrible clamor, and the shadows stirred. One figure detached from the others, a young girl in a faded uniform, her face contorted in sorrow. She floated toward Mira, who, transfixed by the apparition, extended a shaking hand. The girl's eyes locked onto Mira's, and for a long, dreadful moment, time seemed to slow. I could see in that gaze a deep, unending regret, a desperate yearning to be remembered, to be given closure. Then, as abruptly as she had appeared, the ghost vanished. The chimes fell silent. The silence that followed was heavy, pregnant with the weight of 1,000 unanswered questions. In that instant, the final bell of the day sounded from somewhere overhead, a sound out of place amid the hushed despair. It was a clang that reverberated through the bones of the building, a final note in a dirge that spanned generations. We fled up the stairs, nearly stumbling in our haste. Back in the familiar halls of the main school building, the day's earlier merriment seemed a cruel and mocking illusion. We were forever changed, our minds filled with images of grief and spectral voices. Outside, the late afternoon sunlight did little to warm the chill that had settled in our hearts. For days afterward, conversations around school became haunted. Those of us who had ventured into the old wing could not forget the desperate looks and murmured pleas of the ghosts, the lost souls who remained tethered to that cursed day. Rumors spread among the students, and soon the legend of that final day took on a life of its own. Some claimed that the spirits sought to reclaim their forgotten stories, to rewrite the final chapter of their lives by claiming new ones. Others whispered that the school was built on a ground stained by tragedy, that every generation was doomed to relive the contest between youthful hope and ancient despair. I heard rumors of secret rituals performed in the dead of night, of whispered promises to appease the restless dead, of marks left on lockers and hidden in textbooks, symbols that only those who had seen the ghostly figures could decipher. Months passed. Graduation came and went, and I left Ashbury High with a heavy heart and a curse I could never quite shake. Yet, even far from that old school, in the quiet moments between waking and sleep, I could still hear the final bell tolling softly, echoing in the depths of my mind. I saw, in fleeting moments, the ghostly face of the girl from the auditorium, her eyes pleading with a silent command. Return. And I knew that no matter how far I roamed, I would always be a part of that final day, a day when the past reached up from the darkness to remind us that some memories, some regrets, can never truly be laid to rest. Sometimes, as I pass by old buildings or wander deserted streets at dusk, I hear distant chimes in the wind, a reminder that the final bell still tolls somewhere, waiting for the next lost soul to listen. And in that sound, I sense an eternal promise that the horror of that last day will echo through the years, a constant whisper in the dark corners of our memory. The final hour at Ravensbrook. I never thought that the last day of school could be so heavy with dread, but at Ravensbrook High, a sprawling, Gothic structure that had seen generations of students pass through its decaying halls, dusk on graduation day brought with it the strangest of farewells. The morning had begun like any other. Bell schedules, hurried lockers, whispered promises of summer freedom. Yet beneath the veneer of routine, a peculiar heaviness pressed on every heart. I'm Evelyn Crane, a senior whose life at Ravensbrook had always been intertwined with its lore. I'd grown up hearing hushed stories about the school's past, a tragedy, a loss of lives, and untold secrets hidden in its stone corridors. As the final bell rang that fateful afternoon, the laughter and chatter of my classmates quickly dissolved into a chaotic exodus. But unlike the others, I felt a reluctant pull to remain behind, drawn by an inexplicable, almost magnetic yearning to witness the school's final moments for one more day. The hallways were already eerily deserted. I walked slowly past rows of lockers, now rusted and dented with years of neglect, each one a silent keeper of secrets. The corridors seemed to breathe around me. The patterned wallpaper shimmered in the dim light, and the echoes of my footsteps mingled with distant, indistinct murmurs. I couldn't tell if they were trickles of wind or voices, the former students perhaps, whose presence Ravensbrook had never really lost. My first stop was the auditorium, a cavernous space that had once been the venue for our cheerful assemblies and final performances. Today, however, it was bathed in an unsettling twilight. The stage lay cloaked with a heavy layer of dust, broken chairs scattered about like forgotten memories, and the large, ornate clock overhead had stopped at precisely 3:15, the moment the final bell tolled. Its silence was deafening. But then I began to notice things. At the far end of the stage, a faint glimmer caught my eye, a sudden reflection that shouldn't have been there. I strained my eyes, and for just a split second I thought I saw a figure dressed in the uniform of a long-ago student, staring out from behind the curtains. My skin crawled. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me from every shadowed corner. I left the auditorium, heart pounding, and made my way back through the labyrinth of empty classrooms. In one room, I encountered a frozen tableau, desks left as if abandoned mid-lesson, chalk still smudged across the blackboard, and on one wall, in hurried script, the words, "We never left," scrawled in faded, trembling handwriting. The message was raw, pleading, as though the writer sought release from an eternal limbo. As dusk deepened into evening, the school grew almost inhumanly quiet. I found myself in the library, a dusty cavern lined with towering shelves that seemed to loom over me like ancient guardians. Here, the silence was punctuated only by the hum of the old fluorescent lights and the occasional creak of the building settling. I wandered between the stacks, and then I heard it again, the soft whisper of a name. My own name, murmured as though from the distance, sending icy shivers down my spine. I followed the sound, my footsteps echoing as I passed abandoned reading tables and forgotten books, until I reached a secluded corner where the air felt inexplicably heavier. There, faintly illuminated by a shaft of dying light from a high window, lay an open diary. Its pages trembled in the gentle draft, and in spidery letters I read a single chilling line. In the final hour, we are bound to Ravensbrook, trapped for eternity. I closed the diary with trembling fingers, my mind reeling with a sense of imminent doom. Memories of the old legends surged through me. A rumor that on the last day of school, The spirits of those lost within these walls roamed freely, their anguish echoing through every hall. It was said that the building itself served as a living prison, a monument to a past filled with sorrow and regret, and that each final day was not a gentle farewell, but an opening into another realm, one where the dead demanded company. The corridors began to shift as night crept in. No longer were they the orderly passageways of a familiar school. They had morphed into a twisted maze of illusory turns and dead ends. I saw doors that had never been there before, their surfaces warped and covered in unfamiliar symbols. I felt an oppressive presence behind every closed door and sensed countless watching eyes in the darkness. Somewhere, far off, the sound of a clock ticked slowly, its rhythm matching the pounding of my heart. I decided to seek out the old gymnasium, a place notorious among students for its eerie past. The gym, once filled with the raucous cheers of home games and the rhythmic echoes of bouncing basketballs, was now shrouded in gloom. Its vast space was dominated by a single flickering light and an overwhelming sense of abandonment. I stepped inside, and the air was heavy with mildew and old sweat, mixed with an almost metallic tang that made my stomach churn. Then I heard it, a low, mournful hum emanating from the shadows behind the bleachers. The sound was not entirely mechanical. It had a human quality to it, like someone humming a lullaby with a voice soaked in sorrow. I edged closer, every nerve screaming at the thought of what might be there, and peeked behind a row of decaying bleachers. What I saw defied logic. A group of translucent figures huddled together, their forms barely more than wisps of fog. They moved in slow, deliberate motions. Their eyes, if eyes could be seen in their ghostly faces, were filled with immaculate grief, and as they passed in silent procession, I felt their collective agony press upon my soul. In that moment, I understood. Ravensbrook High was not merely haunted by a few lost spirits. It was a living mausoleum, a repository of every fractured memory, every unhealed wound, and every final slammed door that closed on innocence. These apparitions were not malevolent in the usual sense. They were tormented, bound by an ancient despair that refused to relinquish even a glimmer of hope. They mourned the loss of the lives that had been stolen away here, locked forever in the cycles of despair that marked every final day. I tried to run, to escape the inexorable pull of the school's sorrow, but the building itself refused to let me go. The hallways twisted and shortened, trapping me in a network of echoing footsteps and phantom whispers. I turned corner after corner, my mind screaming for an exit that wasn't there. Every door I tried led to another corridor. Every window revealed only endless darkness outside. The sense of claustrophobia was overwhelming, as if the school itself were a living organism fighting to keep me inside its eternal grasp. Desperation drove me to the main administrative wing, the heart of Ravensbrook's ancient secrets. There, in a grand, dusty office lined with faded portraits of stern-faced principals long gone, I constructed a shaky, makeshift plan to escape. I gathered scraps of old keys and documents, hoping they might provide a clue to an exit or a hidden passage. The fading light of the late evening cast long shadows across the room as I pored over a tattered map of the school. An entry caught my eye. A reference to the passage below, allegedly a hidden route beneath the building used by staff during emergencies decades ago. The map was old, the ink faded, but it showed a corridor that descended into the bowels of the school, a potential escape route. Fueled by a desperate need to break free, I followed the map's instructions, venturing deeper into the bowels of Ravensbrook. I navigated through a series of narrow stairwells and forgotten basements, each step echoing in the oppressive silence. The air grew colder and damper the lower I went, and the smell of rust and decay filled my nostrils. It was as if I were burying myself alive, each level dragging me further into a tomb of memories and unresolved grief. At last, I reached a door marked with a single, barely legible symbol, a keyhole adorned with what looked like a skeletal hand clutching a broken bell. Trembling, I inserted the heavy iron key I had found earlier. With a creak that seemed to echo across decades, the door swung open to reveal a narrow corridor lit only by a sputtering, dim overhead bulb. My heart pounded in my ears as I stepped inside. The corridor was unnervingly silent except for slow, measured footsteps that seemed to come not from behind, but from within the walls themselves. I pressed forward, the floor creaking underfoot, and began to see remnants of what once might have been a school basement. Old lockers with peeling paint, abandoned files scattered across a desk, and even a broken trophy case that whispered of past glories, now reduced to dust. In a far corner, I noticed a faded chalkboard with an inscription in large, jagged letters. "There is no final exit. We live here forever." It was then that the corridor trembled with an almost imperceptible vibration. At first, the sound was as soft as a distant heartbeat, but steadily it grew in volume, resonating through the concrete walls and filling my chest with dread. My flashlight flickered and went dark, plunging me into darkness. In that moment, I heard a voice, a clear, desperate whisper that cut through the vibration. "Help me, please. Help me." The plea was not from a ghost, nor from any living person I recognized. It was something older, imbued with a sorrow that transcended time. I fumbled with my phone for its light and turned it on, its weak beam illuminating my surroundings. In the gloom, I saw shapes flickering along the corridor walls, an endless procession of tear-streaked faces, the eyes of hundreds of lost souls, all reaching out toward me in silent imploration. Their mouths moved in wordless anguish, each a reminder of how the school had claimed them over the years. Sweat dripped down my brow as I realized I was not alone. I was surrounded by the remnants of 1,000 final days that had ended in unending despair. The vibration reached a crescendo, and the floors began to shift beneath me. The corridor seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting like a living organism, and the spectral faces began to merge into a single, overarching visage, a towering figure shrouded in shadow, its eyes wells of endless torment, its expression both pleading and accusatory. In that crushing moment, I understood the terrible truth. Ravensbrück was more than a building. It was a prison for lost souls, a nexus where every final day of school had been relived until the boundaries between life and death blurred into perpetual torment. I tried to run, but the corridor elongated before my eyes. Every step only led me deeper into the abyss. The ghostly figure advanced slowly, its presence overwhelming every sense of rational thought. I could feel its icy gaze, its sorrowful yet relentless judgment. The faces of the long-forgotten pressed in on me, their collective grief a tangible force that threatened to swallow all hope of escape. And then, as the spectral figure reached out a massive, trembling hand, I felt a final, shattering collapse of all that I had known. The corridor crumbled into dissonant fragments of memory and shadow. My scream, caught in the vortex of despair, faded into silence. In that final instant, I realized that there was no salvation, only the unbreakable covenant of Ravensbrück High, binding every lost soul to its endless cycle of final days. I found myself suspended in an eternity of drifting memories, a whisper among whispers, a flicker in an endless darkened hall. There was no escape, no hopeful exit. The final hour had become an everlasting sentence, and as I faded into the collective sorrow of Ravensbrück, all I could hear was the relentless echo of a bell tolling far away, a mournful reminder that once you are claimed by this cursed place, you never truly leave. The Phantom Graduation. I never believed that the end of an era could be a curse, until the final day at Hawthorne Academy revealed horrors no student could have imagined. That morning, the air was crisp with promise. The sky, a clear wash of early autumn blue, had whispered of freedom while the halls buzzed with excitement for the forthcoming graduation ceremony. Yet beneath the surface of youthful optimism lurked a secret, buried deep in the aging bricks of the school, a secret that every classmate had learned to ignore in polite conversation and every teacher had carefully concealed behind forced smiles. My name is Miranda Reeves, a senior with dreams of escape and renewal. But that final day became a descent into madness. The school had always been an imposing structure. Its Gothic turrets and shadowed corridors gave it an eerie majesty. I had walked these halls for 4 years, memorizing every creak, every whispered rumor of tragedy from the distant past. Yet none of those familiar ghost stories prepared me for what I was about to experience. The day began normally enough. Lockers clanged shut with the regular rhythm of dismissal, and the noise of chattering students spilled out into the late morning sun. But, as the final class ended, a palpable heaviness replaced the exuberant chaos. Some teachers hesitated in the hallways. Glances were exchanged, eyes filled with apprehension rather than relief. I noticed it first in the main corridor near the grand staircase, a darkness that seemed thicker than usual, as if the very air had grown dense and oppressive. The fluorescent lights, usually steady, flickered in irregular bursts, their hum sounding less like electricity and more like a low morning chant. I tried to dismiss it as nerves. I was, after all, about to graduate, but the uneasy feeling clung to me like a second skin. As my classmates poured out the doors in a stampede of reckless liberation, I found myself drawn back instead of forward. Compelled by a mixture of dread and an inexplicable need to understand, I retraced my familiar steps toward the very heart of Hawthorne Academy. The corridors were deserted now, the earlier echoes of laughter replaced by a profound silence. Every step I took reverberated against cold, tiled floors. Classrooms that once bustled with academic life stood frozen in time. Desks lay askew, blackboards bore half-erased lessons, and the murmurs of long-forgotten recitations seemed to whisper from the peeling walls. I passed by a room where the overhead projector's bulb still glowed faintly, and for a fleeting instant, the words of an old school song, murmured decades ago, drifted through the darkened space. I shuddered and hurried on. Soon, I encountered the library, a cavern of towering shelves that recorded the dreams and disappointments of generations. The pale light seeping through high, dusty windows turned every speck of dust into a tiny star, but the atmosphere was not that of sanctuary. Instead, it was heavy with sorrow. I wandered between the stacks until a soft, almost imperceptible sound halted my progress. It was a faint voice, speaking my name in a tone that mixed longing with despair. I froze. Echoes of laughter and whispers of secrets I did not remember danced behind me, and the silence thickened as if anticipating something unspeakable. Drawn by both fear and a need for answers, I followed that spectral echo to a back corner of the library where old yearbooks and diaries lay scattered. There, on a desk, I found a worn journal. Its cover was cracked leather and its pages yellowed with time, yet the words inside were scrawled in fresh ink. I read a single chilling entry. The final bell is not the end, but a portal. Every graduation binds us to this place for eternity. The ones who remain will never truly leave. My hands trembled as I turned the page, and a cold draft brushed past me, extinguishing a nearby candle with a hiss that resembled a sigh of regret. Shaken, I left the library, my mind racing as I navigated through corridors that now seemed to shift subtly before my eyes. Familiar landmarks contorted into unfamiliar shapes. The trophy case in the hall glowed with a sickly luminescence, and the portraits of past principals appeared to watch me, their painted eyes brimming with sorrow and disapproval. I realized that the school, in its final moments, was awakening dregs of pain and unfinished farewells that had long been repressed. Eventually, I reached the auditorium, the grand theater where countless celebrations and farewells had taken place. Normally, this space pulsed with anticipation during graduation, though now, its stage lay cloaked in thick layers of dust and shadow. The vast space was nearly empty, save for a scattering of discarded programs and a single ancient bell hanging above the proscenium arch. I paused at the threshold, mesmerized by the bell's presence. Its surface was etched with intricate designs, images of weeping figures and anguished faces that swirled together into patterns that defied logic. As I stepped under its arc, the sound of distant chimes stirred, a slow, doleful toll that resonated deep within my bones. Within moments, the auditorium's atmosphere shifted. The overhead lights flickered violently, their brightness waning into an almost baleful glow. From the darkness of the stage, I saw what seemed to be a procession of figures. At first, they appeared as mere shadows, but gradually their forms became more distinct. A gaunt boy in a too large cap, a pale girl with eyes that echoed sorrow, a teacher with downcast, haunted eyes. Their movements were slow and deliberate, as if they were merely performing a final, silent ceremony. I heard their voices, a chorus of murmurs that rose in a soft, undulating rhythm, speaking of loss, regret, and the inexorable pull of Hawthorne itself. I tried to back away, feeling an overwhelming urge to flee, yet the hallways conspired to deny me escape. Every door I reached offered only more corridors that twisted and looped back upon themselves. Every window looked out not onto a world of summer freedom, but onto impenetrable darkness. The final bell's mournful toll seemed to echo all around me, not as a sound, but as a vibration that seeped into my very marrow. I realized then, with mounting horror, that the school was not merely a building. It was alive, a relentless organism of lost hope and unending despair. In a moment of frenzied desperation, I recalled the map I had seen in the main office, a faded blueprint tucked inside an old envelope that mentioned the hidden passage. I clutched it tightly, following its cryptic directions toward a service door near the rear of the building. Every step toward the passageway was a trial, a test of will against a tide of spectral resistance. As I approached the service door, I noticed that the air had grown chillier still, the darkness more suffocating. My breath came in ragged, shallow bursts as I inserted a creaking key I'd found clutched in my trembling fingers. The door groaned open to reveal a narrow staircase descending into utter blackness. I hesitated on the threshold, listening. There, faintly, was the sound of a heartbeat, steady and ominous, pulsing from somewhere deep below. With no alternative, I began my descent, each step echoing like a drumbeat marking the passage of lost time. The stairs seemed to stretch on forever, walls slick with damp, and the air was redolent of decay. I could almost sense the weight of every sorrowful memory this school had ever held, pressing relentlessly upon me. At the bottom of the stairs, I emerged into a vast subterranean corridor, far removed from the chaos of the main building. Here, the oppressive silence was broken only by the soft drip of water and the distant, mournful murmur of voices. The corridor was lined with old locker rooms and abandoned classrooms, relics of a bygone era scattered in a disjointed maze. Tattered posters that once celebrated school spirit hung crookedly on the walls, their images blurred and weeping as if they were in mourning. It was here, in the bowels of Hawthorne Academy, that the true nature of the curse revealed itself. Before me stretched a massive chamber, its ceiling lost in shadow, its floor scattered with the remnants of broken glass, shredded paper, and personal belongings that had been long forgotten. In the center of this chamber was an enormous cracked mirror, its surface marred by streaks of dark, viscous material. As I drew closer, I recognized my own reflection, but it was distorted, ghostly, with eyes that seemed hollow and filled with unspeakable anguish. Behind me, the mirror's surface began to ripple and stir as if it were a living thing. Faint voices rose from within, whispering secrets of eternal confinement, of a promise that every graduating soul would become part of the school's unending lament. A sudden chill slithered down my spine as I heard a clear, pleading voice behind me. "Help us." I spun around, but the corridor behind was empty, save for shapes barely perceptible in the dim light. The voices grew louder, more insistent. The crying of children, the sobs of teachers, a cacophony of sorrow that threatened to shatter my mind. I felt invisible hands brush my skin, cold and unyielding as though trying to drag me away into that mirror's abyss. Desperation clawed at my insides now. I stumbled back toward the staircase, but the corridor seemed to shift and close in, no longer offering a route to escape. The echoes of the final bell were all around me now, a dreadful litany that promised that no soul would ever truly leave Hawthorne Academy. I realized with a growing, paralyzing horror that the curse was absolute. Every final day, every last moment of innocence lost, had been harvested and bound to the halls, and I too was destined to be part of this endless assembly of sorrow. I sank to my knees, heart hammering as the spectral chorus swelled in unison, the voices melding into one overwhelming dirge that whispered, "You belong to us now." In that moment, I felt the weight of centuries of despair, a crushing gravity that stilled my limbs and snuffed out every spark of defiance. The mirror before me began to pulse with a sickly red light as images of past graduates, faces twisted in despair, mouths open in silent screams, flashed before my eyes. Their eyes, once filled with the promise of youth, now shone with the finality of doom. As I reached out helplessly toward the mirror, I saw, in its rippling surface, the full, terrible truth. No one ever truly left Hawthorne. Every graduation, every final day, was but a doorway through which the lost were drawn back into the building's eternal embrace. I could hear my own voice, distorted and echoing, join the unending chorus of those who had been trapped here. The specters of those who had vanished over the years swirled around me, and in one final, shattering moment, my will disintegrated into despair. There was no escape, no salvation, only the relentless, horrifying certainty that my final day had become an eternal sentence. The mirror's surface consumed me, pulling me into a void where every echo of the last bell resonated with the anguish of lost youth. I became one with the endless procession of ghostly graduates, my identity dissolving into the collective lament of Hawthorne Academy. As the final chime reverberated through the darkened depths, I felt my soul fracture and scatter like shards of broken glass, each a silent testament to a future undone. In that forsaken chamber, with the red glow of the mirror fading to black, I joined the countless voices chained to the school's malignant spirit. The phantom graduation had claimed me, and I was left to wander those cursed halls for all eternity, an invisible, tormented witness to a final day that would never end. The classroom that never emptied. The last day of school was supposed to be a relief, a final goodbye to the monotony of lectures, the endless tests, and the suffocating walls of Blackwood High. But for me, it was something else entirely. It was the day I realized that some classrooms never truly empty, and some lessons are never meant to be learned. It started with detention. I wasn't supposed to be there. I'd never been the kind of student who got into trouble. But Mr. Grayson, the history teacher with a permanent scowl etched into his face, had caught me whispering to a friend during his lecture on the town's forgotten tragedies. He'd sent me to room 104, the detention room, with a warning that I'd regret it if I didn't learn to respect authority. Room 104 was different from the other classrooms. It was older, its walls lined with faded wallpaper that peeled at the edges. The desks were scratched and worn, their surfaces etched with the names of students long gone. The air was heavy, carrying the faint scent of mildew and something else, something metallic and sharp. I was alone when I entered, the fluorescent lights flickering overhead. The room felt colder than the rest of the school, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. I sat at the desk closest to the door, my heart pounding as I waited for Mr. Grayson to arrive and deliver his usual lecture on discipline and respect. But he never came. The minutes ticked by, the silence growing heavier with each passing second. I glanced at the clock on the wall, its hands frozen at 3:15. My phone showed the same time, as if the room itself had stopped the flow of time. I stood, my chair scraping against the floor, and moved to the door. It was locked. "Mr. Grayson?" I called out, my voice trembling. I think the door's stuck." No answer. I tried the handle again, twisting and pulling with all my strength, but it wouldn't budge. Panic began to set in as I pounded on the door, shouting for help. The sound echoed through the room, but no one came. And then I heard it. A faint whisper, like the rustling of leaves in the wind. It came from the back of the room, where the shadows pooled in the corners. I turned slowly, my breath catching in my throat as I saw them. The desks were no longer empty. Students sat in the chairs, their heads bowed and their hands folded neatly on the desks. Their faces were pale and expressionless, their eyes staring blankly ahead. They didn't move, didn't speak, but I could feel their presence pressing down on me like a weight. "Hello?" I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Who are you?" The whispers grew louder, filling the room with a sound that was both soothing and terrifying. The students began to move, their heads turning in unison to face me. Their eyes were hollow, their mouths twisted into grotesque smiles. "Join us," they said, their voices blending into a single haunting chorus. I stumbled backward, my heart racing as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. The whispers grew louder, the students' smiles widening as they stood and began to move toward me. Their movements were slow and deliberate, their footsteps echoing through the room. "Stay away!" I shouted, grabbing a chair and holding it in front of me like a shield. But they didn't stop. Their hollow eyes bore into me, their smiles stretching impossibly wide. The whispers became a deafening roar, the sound reverberating through my skull. I swung the chair, the metal legs connecting with one of the students, but instead of falling, they dissolved into a cloud of black smoke, their laughter echoing through the room. The others closed in, their hands reaching for me, their touch cold and clammy. I fought back, swinging the chair wildly as I tried to keep them at bay, but no matter how many I struck, they kept coming, their laughter growing louder and more sinister. The room seemed to shrink around me, the walls closing in as the students surrounded me. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The students were gone, the room silent and still. I stood in the center of the room, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The door was open, the hallway beyond empty and quiet. I ran, my footsteps echoing through the halls as I fled the school. The air outside was warm and bright, the sun shining down on the students gathered in the parking lot. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Even now, years later, I can still hear the whispers. They follow me wherever I go, a constant reminder of the classroom that never emptied. And sometimes, when I close my eyes, I see them, the hollow-eyed students, their twisted smiles, waiting for me to join them. The vanishing afternoon. The morning of the last day of school was unlike any other. When I first arrived at Harrowfield High that day, the sun rose in a sky streaked with muted crimson and gray, as if mourning the passing of time itself. I'm Lydia Mercer, a senior who had spent countless days pacing the familiar halls of this aging building, but none of that ordinary routine could have prepared me for the horror that was about to unfold. That morning, the school seemed different in subtle, unsettling ways. The corridors, usually filled with the laughter and chatter of students impatient for the weekend, were unusually silent. Lockers creaked open in the damp air, and even the fluorescent lights overhead flickered, as if struggling to hold back a memory too painful to display. An almost imperceptible shift in the atmosphere hinted that Harrowfield High was a place where past grudges and long-buried secrets refused to rest. Rumors had circulated for years about a tragedy that occurred decades ago on the last day of school, a day when something inexplicable happened to a class of students, vanishing without a trace. Most dismissed it as a grim legend, a macabre fairy tale to scare younger children. But today, as the final day unfolded, it became clear that the whispers were more than mere stories. My friends and I gathered in our usual spot by the old oak tree in the courtyard, trying to make light of the day. Ethan, ever the defiant optimist, joked about summer romances and endless freedom, while Mira and Jordan shared secret glances laden with anticipation and dread. I felt a strange heaviness in my chest, a premonition that what was to come would shatter our lives. As the final bell neared, A slow, oppressive malaise settled over us, as if the building itself were drawing in a deep, sorrowful breath. During our last period, an ordinary English class that, ironically, had grown strangely surreal, the teacher's words dissolved into a hollow murmur. Instead of discussing the final essay or offering words of farewell, Mrs. Lang seemed distracted, her eyes darting toward the window as if she were watching shadows pass by outside. The clock on the wall ticked monotonously until, with a resonant clang that sent shivers through the room, it abruptly stopped at exactly 2:17 p.m. The silence that followed was suffocating. Everyone in the class exchanged nervous glances, and I noticed a subtle change in the air, a chill that wasn't there before, the hint of something ancient and sorrowful. At the precise moment when the last bell would normally herald our release, the sound never came. Instead, the overhead lights dimmed, plunging the room into an eerie half-light. Mrs. Lang's hand shook as she clutched the edge of her desk, and a low moan escaped from somewhere deep within the building. It wasn't a human cry, but a sound that resembled the earth lamenting its own despair. A pall of dread descended on the class, and even the bravest among us felt that our senses were being infiltrated by an unseen force. After class, while most of the students ran to celebrate the end of term, a small group of us lingered in a mixture of curiosity and terror. Ethan, his previous bravado evaporated in the wake of the inexplicable events, urged us together. "We need to see what's going on," he said in a hushed tone. "Something's not right with the school. It's like time itself is breaking here." Maya, an insightful friend with eyes that seemed to look beyond the surface, nodded slowly, her face etched with worry. Jordan, normally the practical one, looked ambivalent, caught between fear and a desperate need for answers. We decided to venture into the abandoned wing of Harrow Field, a section of the school that had been shuttered after a series of mysterious incidents years ago. The door to that wing was normally locked, but today it hung slightly ajar, as if inviting us, or daring us, to uncover its secrets. With trembling hands and a mix of childish resolve and adult apprehension, we slipped past the threshold. Inside, the corridor was shrouded in darkness. The only light came from the sporadic glow of cell phones and a few dusty overhead fixtures that flickered weakly. The walls were adorned with old photographs and faded messages, snippets of the past that spoke of happier times and lost souls. As we moved further down the corridor, a palpable silence enveloped us. It was a silence so deep that even the faintest sound, a cough, a whisper, seemed deafening. At the end of the hall, we entered an old classroom that had been frozen in time. Desks stood in neat rows, and a blackboard bore the remnants of a lesson long forgotten. In the corner of the room, framed in cracked glass, hung a faded portrait of students from decades past. Their eyes, though painted, seemed to follow us with an unsettling intensity. The atmosphere was thick with an inexplicable melancholy, and I could almost hear soft voices murmuring beneath the silence, as if echoing secrets from too long ago. Suddenly, the silence was shattered by a sound, a slow, deliberate creaking from the doorway at the back of the room. We froze. The sound was accompanied by a faint, ragged whisper, barely audible yet laden with sorrow. "Remember us." It was as if the very air was laden with the voices of those long departed. Ethan whispered, "Did you hear that?" And we huddled closer, our eyes wide with a mix of terror and morbid fascination. Mira, usually the boldest among us, led the way as we crept toward the source. With every step, the temperature dropped further, our breath misting in the dim light. We pushed open the door slowly, and what we saw made our blood run cold. Before us stretched a long, narrow corridor lined with lockers and old classroom doors. But these weren't ordinary corridors. They seemed to extend beyond the limits of the building, vanishing into shadow. The walls were scrawled with names and dates, messages written in a spidery hand, as if by countless hands lost in time. The whispering grew louder as we entered, a chorus of voices speaking in unison, a refrain of pain and longing that echoed, "Return, return." Our hearts hammered, and Jordan's hand shook as he held his phone aloft to record the phenomena, though his device soon captured nothing but faint static and the occasional spectral image of a tear-streaked face. Every shadow, every distant sound was now charged with an almost tangible malice. We felt that we were intruding into a sacred, forbidden space, a place where grief had lodged itself for so long that it had taken on a life of its own. Then, as we reached the corridor's end, the lights flickered violently and a shudder ran through the building. The walls seemed to pulsate as if breathing. A door at the far end swung open on its own, and through the gap we glimpsed the source of the uncanny sound, a battered auditorium bathed in a ghostly silver light. The auditorium, once a place of celebration and shared joy, had become a mausoleum of despair. Rows of empty seats faced a stage draped in tattered curtains that billowed as if stirred by an unseen wind. And behind the stage, in the deep recesses of the dark, a final bell tolled, a sound so mournful and profound that it seemed to shake the very souls of those who heard it. I felt an irresistible pull, a desire to confront the past and understand its sorrow. Against our better judgment, we crossed the threshold into that vast, echoing space. The moment we stepped inside, the air felt thick with energy, a vibration that set our hairs on edge. In the center of the stage stood an oversized clock, its face broken, its hands frozen at a time that made no sense. With every toll, the clock rang out like a dirge, and the sound reverberated off every wall, every beam of the building. The rhythmic, despairing toll seemed to awaken something hidden in the darkness. At that moment, a figure emerged from behind the curtains, a figure of a student, draped in shadows, its face obscured by a hood. Slowly, it moved toward the front, its steps measured and deliberate. As it neared, the room fell into an overwhelming stillness. The figure stopped in the center of the stage and raised a hand as if to bid farewell. Then, in a voice that was both a whisper and a roar, it spoke a single word: "Return." The word sent shockwaves through us. The ghostly figure's eyes, barely visible under the hood, glowed with sorrow and something darker, a darkness that suggested endless regret. In that moment, the auditorium seemed to come alive with the muted presence of all those lost in the corridors of time. The clock's toll grew louder, more insistent, and lights began to shatter around us in a burst of harsh, white noise. Panic took over. We fled the auditorium through a door that led back to the corridor, the echo of our frantic footsteps mingling with that ghostly refrain. Outside, the late afternoon sun was already sinking, casting long, disorienting shadows across the school grounds. The world felt profoundly altered, as if the boundaries between life and death, past and present, had been blurred beyond repair. In the chaos that followed, I found myself alone in the hall near the main entrance. I could hear the quiet weeping of distant voices and see the outline of a figure at the corner of my eye. A figure watching silently, its gaze heavy with unspeakable grief. And then, as the final remnants of daylight flickered away, the building's speakers crackled to life. Overwhelming static gave way to a soft, almost tender whisper. "Remember us. Remember. Return." There was no music, no announcement, just that eternal, eerie plea that chilled me to the bone. In that moment, I realized that the legacy of that last day of school had become far greater than any simple memory or youthful celebration. It was now a curse, haunting those who dared to remember, a call from the departed that promised to pull them back into a realm of infinite sorrow. I fled, tears streaming down my face, abandoning the secrets of Harrowfield High that would forever be etched into my soul. Even now, years later, I cannot escape the echo of that final bell. Every time I close my eyes, I hear its resonance, the ghostly plea of return reverberating across time. I've tried to move on, to bury those memories under layers of rationality and denial. But they persist, an endless cycle of loss and despair. I wonder if one day, a new generation will heed the call of that cursed day, drawn by the same irrepressible force that claimed us. Until then, the specter of that final afternoon lingers, a dark reminder that some endings are beginnings of an endless, tormented night. The Blackboard of Sorrow. I always imagined that the last day of school would be a jubilant climax, a final burst of relief and promise of freedom. But no one ever warned me that it could also be a day when the past clawed its way back from the depths of memory and sorrow. My name is Evelyn Caldwell, and I have spent 30 years teaching in this crumbling old building, Harrow Ridge Academy. On that final day of the year, I learned that some lessons are written not in textbooks, but on the slick surface of a haunted blackboard. That morning, a dull, overcast sky loomed above the academy. The autumn wind whispered along the empty corridors as I made my way to my classroom. There was an unusual hush in the air. Even the creaks of ancient floorboards sounded more like mourning than the lively chatter of youthful footsteps. I unlocked my classroom door and stepped into the space that, for years, had borne witness to laughter and learning. But today, as I flipped on the lights, I sensed an oppressive weight. The midday sun fought its way through grimy windows, throwing long, distorted shadows against peeling walls. I arranged a few stray student assignments on my teacher's desk and looked up at the blackboard with its glossy, dark surface. A relic from an earlier era, hand-painted with faded outlines of formulas and quotes. I always admired its silent dignity. But that day something in it called to me. I felt a slight chill run down my spine as if the board were harboring secrets that it had long kept hidden. In the back of my mind, I recalled whispers about a tragic event that had happened decades ago in a classroom much like mine, a day when voices were silenced unexpectedly and the sorrow of young souls was never laid to rest. I dismissed it as one of the many ghost stories passed along in hushed tones by staff and students alike. The day wore on. The bell's chime, normally a cheerful cue to freedom, now struck with a heavy finality. My students filled the room with a subdued excitement as they bantered about upcoming vacations and parting words. I watched them, feeling a growing disquiet. Their eyes seemed to dart toward the corners, as if already sensing something amiss. Throughout the day, small, inexplicable things occurred. A few whispered remarks about strange reflections in the window, an extra chill in the room when no one could account for it, and an inexplicable murmur beneath the usual end-of-day chatter. I chalked it up to our collective end-of-year nerves. After the final class ended, the hallways buzzed with the exuberance of youth, but I lingered behind. I decided to pack up and prepare for my own solitary walk through the now oppressive corridors. As I passed by the empty classrooms, memories whooshed over me. Childhood laughter, the rustle of notebooks, and the soft murmur of a teacher's kind voice. Yet today, those memories came with an undercurrent of cold dread. When I reached my own room, I found that the old blackboard had changed. What began as innocuous streaks of chalk dust soon formed into words that were not mine. They glowed faintly in the dim light. Remember us. Never forget. My hand trembled as I reached for the marker that I always kept in its special nook, but those words seemed to writhe on the board as if alive. I blinked, certain I had imagined it, but when I looked again, the message remained, now accompanied by a list of dates, years that spanned back across forgotten eras. I deciphered one date, 1967, memories of a long-canceled event, a rumored school tragedy, flitted at the edge of my mind. A chill stormed through me. Had the board somehow absorbed the pain of that long-ago day? I gathered my things slowly, my heart pounding in my ears, and stepped into the now silent hallway. The corridors were darkening earlier than usual, as if the building itself was succumbing to an ancient sorrow. I passed by closed classroom doors and half-forgotten bulletin boards until I reached the staircase leading to the old wing of the school, a section that had been sealed off after a series of inexplicable incidents. Everyone knew that the stories whispered of that wing, that on the last day, when the final hour struck, The building's ghosts walked open halls to reclaim their stories. I hesitated. There was an almost irresistible pull, a blending of professional duty and a strange personal compulsion to confront whatever lay behind that door. My footsteps echoed in the deserted corridor as I slowly pushed aside the heavy, rusted door. The air inside was stale, laced with the odor of decaying paper and old wood. It was quiet in a way that was not peaceful, but laden with deep sorrow and regret. The narrow hallway was lined with lockers that bore names and dates, scratched into the metal by trembling hands of past students. I paused before one locker. The paint was chipped, and the metal surface was marred by an inscription that read, "Forever remembered." My heart felt heavy, as if that simple phrase carried the weight of an unspoken loss. I moved on and entered an old classroom that was now completely dark. I flipped the light switch. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, faintly, the overhead bulbs flickered to life with a buzzing sound. The room was empty, yet the blackboard stood at the front, its surface smoother than ever and exuding a soft, malevolent glow. I approached it slowly. On its once pristine surface, new words began to form, first as small smudges, then as deliberate strokes of chalk. "We are here." My breath caught in my throat. I tried to wipe the chalk away with my hand, but it merely smudged, rearranging itself into a different message. "Lost souls linger." It was as though the board was speaking with the voices of those who had suffered, the silent remnants of a tragic past, desperate to be acknowledged. A sudden gust of wind, impossible for a sealed classroom, ripped through, scattering sheets of paper and sending a shudder through the walls. I heard a plaintive, almost inaudible sound like distant weeping. Then came a whisper that seemed to emanate from the very blackness behind the board. "Help us. Remember your promise." My vision blurred, and for an instant I saw faces, pale, anguished faces of children and youths who reached out from the shadows in silent agony. Their eyes pleaded with me, and in that instant I understood that these were the spirits of those who had suffered on this cursed day in the past, and who now sought to entwine with the present. I staggered back, heart pounding in terror and sorrow. As I ran from the classroom, I could hear the echo of a school bell, a chime that did not belong to the normal schedule, but a deep, resonant toll that shook the very foundations of the building. It echoed down the corridor, followed by the sound of footsteps that weren't mine. I ran, barely daring to look back, as the haunted hallways seemed to converge into darkness. In the distance, I caught fleeting shadows, ghostly students, silent and sorrowful, drifting alongside me like memories refusing to fade. Outside, the late afternoon light had all but vanished, replaced by an eerie twilight that blotted out the cheer of graduation. I reached the courtyard, where a few other students had gathered in small clusters, their voices trembling as they recounted inexplicable sounds and flickering lights in empty hallways. None of them could explain what they had seen in the old wing. Their excited chatter had given way to hushed terror. A sense of collective grief hung over us, intermingled with the fear that the cursed events might yet repeat. I could not shake the image of the blackboard and its sorrowful message. Over the next few days, as graduation loomed ever closer, the entire school seemed to wear a heavy shroud of despair. In every classroom and corridor, phantom echoes of the past were evident. In whispered conversations cutting off mid-sentence, in the creaking of lockers opening to reveal names of those long gone. Late at night, when I lay awake in my small apartment far from Harrow Ridge, I heard the faint echoes of a school bell, like a reminder that the past never truly rests. The voices pleaded, "Return. Remember." Determined to understand, I delved into the Academy's forgotten archives. In a dusty, neglected wing of the school library, I uncovered brittle, yellowed records that recounted the tragic history of Harrow Ridge. Decades ago, a fire had ravaged the old wing during a final day of school celebration, claiming the lives of several students, a catastrophe covered up over time by administrative silence and hushed rumors. The records spoke of inexplicable phenomena in the aftermath, of empty classrooms where unseen hands wiped away evidence of the tragedy, of spectral figures wandering the hallways, and of a promise made in despair, the promise to remember, to keep alive the voices of those who had been silenced. Every new revelation deepened the horror. The blackboard in my classroom was not a mere teaching tool. It was a conduit, an eerie canvas upon which the anguish and regrets of the lost were inscribed for eternity. It seemed that each year, on the last day of school, the barrier between the living and the dead thinned, allowing the sorrowful remnants of that terrible day to seep into the present. And now, in my final year as a teacher, I was caught between a duty to educate and a desperate need to honor a tragic past that refused to die. On graduation day, as the school prepared for the final farewell, I could sense a shift in the atmosphere, a palpable tension in the air, as if the very building mourned its own history. In the final assembly in the auditorium, beneath a sky streaked with melancholy clouds, I stood at the podium to deliver a farewell speech. My hands trembled as I recalled all I had learned, both from textbooks and from the haunted walls of Harrowridge. I spoke of hope, resilience, and the promise of a future beyond these hallowed halls. Yet even as I tried to summon warmth in my words, I could hear the distant sound of a bell tolling, a sound that should have been drowned out by applause, but instead resonated with an eerie finality. As I finished my speech, the overhead lights flickered and dimmed, and for a heartbeat, the auditorium fell utterly silent. Then, in the corner of my vision, I saw a solitary figure, a pale, indistinct shape, standing by an empty row of seats. The figure's gaze was fixed upon me, and I felt the overwhelming presence of ancient sorrow and unfulfilled promise. It was as though the spirit of one of those long-lost students had risen to claim her rightful place in this final rite. The crowd parted in a murmur of disbelief as the apparition drifted slowly toward the stage. I tried to speak, to call out a greeting or apology, but my voice was choked by a dread I could not dispel. The figure stopped directly in front of me. Its eyes, deep pools of forlorn despair, bore into mine, and in that unspoken moment, I understood that the promise to remember was not a choice. It was a bond. The past had reached out to reclaim what it had lost and to ensure that its tragedy would never be forgotten. Then, with a sudden burst of supernatural energy, the lights in the auditorium flared with a blinding glare. The figure dissolved into a swirl of fading light and whispered echoes, leaving behind a silence that was heavier than death. When the brightness receded, the room was empty of the apparition. In its place, an overwhelming sadness saturated the air, a final farewell that transcended the limits of our mortal understanding. In the years that followed, I left Harrowridge Academy behind, seeking solace in distant places and new beginnings. Yet, wherever I went, the memory of that final day clung to me like a shadow. At dusk, when the light fades and the world grows quiet, I sometimes think I can hear the mournful toll of that phantom bell. Despite all my efforts to move on, the sorrow of those lost souls lingers in my heart. I have learned that some legacies are not meant to be forgotten. They are entrusted to us, haunting reminders that every ending carries with it the weight of the unavenged and the unremembered. I still gargle with a fragile hope that one day the haunted voices will finally find their peace. But until that day comes, I bear the burden of their memories, the endless echo of a final, sorrowful message scrawled on a cursed blackboard, the one last lesson that I will never, ever unlearn. In the weeks that followed graduation, I tried to escape the memories of Harrowridge Academy by leaving town. I moved to a small apartment on the outskirts of the city, far from the crumbling brick structure that had haunted me for so long. Yet even in the quiet of my new home, I could not escape the relentless pull of that final day. Each night, as I lay in bed under the oppressive darkness of a late autumn sky, I awoke drenched in cold sweat. The memory of that cursed blackboard, the ghostly inscription and the whisper of forgotten voices, would come unbidden, invading my dreams with a sorrow so deep it haunted every waking moment. One rainy evening, as I flipped through an old album containing faded photographs of school days, I found an image that made my heart shudder. In a candid shot taken by the old oak tree in the courtyard, I noticed, almost imperceptibly in the background, a figure with sorrowful eyes watching us from a distance. At the time, I had assumed it was a trick of light or a stray shadow, but the sharp clarity of adulthood made me realize it was real. That discovery reopened a wound I thought had long begun to scar over, and I became consumed with desperate questions. Who was that watching us? Did that spirit, this restless echo of a life cut short, follow us out of that cursed building? Was it drawn to those who still remembered? Unable to find solace in sleep or in the quiet of my isolated apartment, I eventually sought out the school once more. I tried to convince myself that by retracing my steps, I might finally put that terrible chapter to rest. Despite the long separation, Harrow Academy still stood, its windows dark and its corridors silent. I returned on an overcast afternoon, the sky a flat expanse of iron gray. The building loomed ominously as I stepped through its heavy front doors, and even here the oppressive weight of past sorrow pressed down on me. Every step down its familiar halls filled me with a growing dread, as if the walls themselves whispered accusingly of secrets I wished I could forget. I began my search in the old wing. The corridor with the chalked messages lay exactly as I remembered it, though a fine layer of dust now covered the once pristine inscriptions. Trembling, I traced my fingers along the words that still glowed faintly in the dim light. Remember us. Never forget. They burned into my skin like scars. I sat on a cold bench beneath a locker etched with names and dates, feeling the maddening echo of lost voices. Was it possible that the spirits, those desperate, long-forgotten souls, had not yet found their peace? I could almost hear soft murmurings, like the brushing of fingertips over blackboard paint, as if beckoning me to learn more of their unhallowed story. That night I camped in the school library, haunted by the flickering neon of a single desk lamp. As the hours deepened into darkness, the building's silence began to warp. I heard the unmistakable sound of a school bell echoing faintly in the distance, a sound that should have already been silent. At first, it was a gentle chime, barely perceptible. Then, as the minutes ticked by, it grew louder, more insistent, until it filled the quiet with its sorrowful cadence. I rose from my desk, drawn by a compulsion I could neither resist nor fully understand, and followed the sound. It led me down deserted corridors and past empty classrooms, into the very heart of the old wing. In each shadowed corner, I thought I saw figures, just outline hints of children huddled in eternal grief. At one point, in a forgotten classroom where rows of desks lay silent beneath a thick coat of dust, I turned to see a chalk mark slowly forming on the board. It was no random smear of residue. It was letters, deliberate and slow, forming a single haunting sentence. We are bound by sorrow. I staggered back, heart pounding with an emotion that was equal parts terror and pity. I could feel the presence of those voices. They were not angry, not vengeful, but laden with an unbearable grief that spanned decades. It was as if these souls, trapped in the purgatory of Harrowridge, were calling out for someone to remember them, to help lift the curse that tethered them to this place. I spent the remainder of that long night taking notes, recording every creak of the floor, every flicker of the failing lights, every soft whisper that the darkness seemed to birth. By the time the faint light of dawn filtered through the grimy windows, I had filled several notebooks with desperate scribbles and half-formed thoughts. I could not tell if what I experienced was the product of a mind unraveling under the weight of loss and isolation, or if the very building harbored a supernatural torment that left no mind unscathed. All I knew was that Harrowridge Academy was not simply a memory. It was a living grave of unfulfilled promises and unavenged sorrows. In the following months, I became a reluctant storyteller, recounting my experiences to a few close friends who had also once roamed those haunted corridors. Their faces would blanch as I described the phantom bell, the ghostly figure in the courtyard, and the endless whispers left behind on the blackboard. Some called it a fevered dream brought on by nostalgia and loss. Others whispered that I had come into contact with something beyond the pall of mere memory. A curse, perhaps, passed down through generations, a burden that would never let us forget the tragedies of the past. Yet, with every retelling, I felt the curse grow heavier. At night, as I sat in my quiet apartment, faint echoes of distant chimes and the soft sorrow of ghostly voices invaded my thoughts. I began to see in the corners of my eyes fleeting images of pale faces, half lit by the glare of a setting sun. I wondered if there were others like myself, doomed to carry such pain, unable to move forward until the past was finally laid to rest. One bitter autumn evening, a letter arrived from an anonymous sender. Its paper was old and yellowed, the handwriting elegant yet pleading. It read, "Your kin are not free. The promise to remember is a bond. Seek the key in the blackboard's depths, and you may yet bring us rest." I was unsettled to the core. The key, it seemed, was not a physical object, but perhaps a final act of acknowledgement, a ritual that might sever the unyielding tether between the living and the dead within those cursed halls. That night, determination overcame despair. I resolved to return once more, not as a reluctant witness, but as an agent of release. I gathered all of my notes and references, the flickering messages, the spectral whispers, the secret inscriptions etched into every hidden corner of Harrowridge, and prepared a carefully measured plan to confront the malevolent force. I reached out secretly to a former colleague, a local historian who specialized in paranormal occurrences in old schools. Together, we pored over records of tragedies, piecing together a mosaic of sorrow dating back decades. The more we discovered, the clearer it became. Our school had been a crucible of untold grief, its walls impregnated with the desperate cries of souls who died too soon, who never found closure. Armed with this grim knowledge, I organized a solitary midnight vigil in the very classroom that had first borne the cursed inscription. With trembling hands, I set up candles and laid out my notebooks. I took a deep breath as the hour grew late, and I began to speak softly, to recite aloud the names and dates that I had unearthed. I read passages as if they were incantations, seeking to honor the tragedy and, perhaps, to release the restless spirits bound to that place. As I spoke, the air around me began to thicken, and the shadows on the blackboard stirred. Slowly, indecipherable lines of chalk rearranged themselves, forming new words that glowed faintly in the flicker of candlelight. Forgiveness is the key. A surge of inexplicable warmth coursed through me, a sensation both comforting and terrible, as though I were being enveloped in the long-forgotten embrace of those who had suffered. In that moment, I understood that true remembrance did not lie in endless torment, but in the act of honoring their memory with compassion. Tears streamed down my face as I continued my recitation, my voice merging with the soft, almost imperceptible murmur emerging from the very walls. Outside, as the first light of dawn crept up over the horizon, the oppressive weight seemed to lift ever so slightly. For a fleeting moment, the school fell silent as if holding its breath. It was in that final, fragile pause that I sensed something shift, a gentle exhalation from the ancient void, as though the spirits were finally granted the respite they had long craved. The blackboard, now at peace, bore one last inscription in a delicate hand. "We are free." I left Harrowridge that day with mixed feelings. Though the final act of remembrance had eased the heavy sorrow that clung to me like a shroud, I knew the scars would remain. The building itself continued to stand, a testament to the lives intertwined within its walls, but a small part of the malign influence had been lifted, if only enough to allow those who survived to move on. But even as time passed, the memory of that night, the echo of the final mournful chime, the spectral whispers, and the bittersweet promise that we once offered to the lost, remains with me. In quiet moments, I still hear that soft, distant bell, and I see half-glimpsed faces in the flicker of candlelight. And I wonder if somewhere, in the lingering darkness of Harrowridge Academy, those names are finally at peace if only for a while. Yet the final lesson is eternal. The past, no matter how painful, must be met with compassion, for only then can even the darkest sorrow be transformed into a promise of release. The yearbook that knew too much. The last day of school was supposed to be a time for nostalgia, for signing yearbooks and saying goodbyes. But at Hollow Creek High, it was something else entirely. It was the day the yearbook came to life. I was in the library when it started. The air was thick with the smell of old paper and dust, and the fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead. I had stayed behind to help Mrs. Calloway, the librarian, sort through the leftover yearbooks. Most of the students had already left, their laughter echoing faintly down the empty halls. The stack of yearbooks sat on the table in front of me, their glossy covers gleaming under the harsh light. "Just put them in the storage closet when you're done," Mrs. Calloway said, her voice tired. "I'll lock up after you." I nodded, flipping through one of the books absent-mindedly. The pages were filled with the usual photos: smiling students, awkward group shots, and candid moments from pep rallies and dances. But as I turned the pages, something caught my eye. A photo of the senior class, taken in front of the school's main entrance, seemed wrong. The faces were blurred, their features distorted as if the photo had been taken underwater. And in the background, barely visible, was a shadowy figure standing in the doorway. I frowned, leaning closer to the page. The figure was tall and thin, its face obscured by darkness. It wasn't a student or a teacher, I was sure of that. And yet, something about it felt familiar, like a half-remembered nightmare. "Probably just a printing error," I muttered to myself, closing the book. But as I reached for another, the lights flickered and a chill ran down my spine. The library, once warm and inviting, suddenly felt cold and oppressive. I glanced around, my heart pounding. The room was empty, the only sound the faint hum of the air conditioning. But then I heard it, a soft rustling, like pages turning. It was coming from the stack of yearbooks. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The rustling grew louder, more insistent, as if the books were alive. Slowly, I reached out and opened the top book. The pages flipped on their own, stopping at a photo of the school's cafeteria. The image was grainy and dark, the tables and chairs empty. But in the corner of the photo, barely visible, was the same shadowy figure. "What the hell?" I whispered, slamming the book shut. The rustling stopped, and the room fell silent once more. I grabbed the stack of yearbooks and hurried to the storage closet, my hands trembling. The closet was small and cramped, filled with old textbooks and forgotten supplies. I shoved the books onto a shelf and turned to leave, but the door slammed shut behind me. "Hello!" I called out, my voice echoing in the confined space. I tried the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Panic set in as I pounded on the door, shouting for help. But no one came. And then the rustling started again. I turned slowly, my heart racing. The yearbooks were moving, their pages flipping wildly as if caught in a gust of wind. One by one, they fell to the floor, their covers snapping open. The photos inside began to change, the smiling faces replaced by twisted, grotesque images. Students with hollow eyes and gaping mouths stared back at me, their expressions frozen in silent screams. "No," I whispered, backing away. "This isn't real. This can't be real." The rustling grew louder, the pages turning faster and faster until the sound was deafening. And then, all at once, it stopped. The room fell silent, the air heavy with an unnatural stillness. I looked down at the books, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The photos were normal again, the smiling faces and candid moments restored. But as I reached for one of the books, a hand shot out from the pages. I screamed, stumbling backward as the hand clawed its way out of the book. It was pale and skeletal, its fingers long and bony. Another hand followed, and then a head, its face obscured by shadows. The figure from the photos was crawling out of the yearbook, its movements jerky and unnatural. "Stay away!" I shouted, grabbing a nearby chair and swinging it at the figure. The chair passed through it as if it were made of smoke, and the figure let out a low, guttural growl. It lunged at me, its hands outstretched, and I ducked, scrambling for the door. The handle turned easily this time, and I burst into the hallway, my heart pounding. The lights flickered wildly, casting long, distorted shadows on the walls. I ran, my footsteps echoing through the empty halls. The figure was behind me, its growls growing louder with each passing second. I could feel its presence, cold and suffocating, as it closed the distance between us. I turned a corner and slammed into someone. It was Mrs. Calloway, her face pale and her eyes wide with fear. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice trembling. "There's something in the yearbooks," I said, my words tumbling out in a frantic rush. "Something not human." Mrs. Calloway didn't question me. She grabbed my arm and pulled me toward the front doors, her grip firm and steady. But as we reached the entrance, the doors slammed shut, the sound echoing through the building. The figure appeared at the end of the hallway, its shadow stretching toward us like a living thing. Mrs. Calloway stepped in front of me, her expression grim. "Go," she said, her voice steady. "I'll hold it off." "No," I said, shaking my head. "I'm not leaving you." "You have to," she said, her eyes locking onto mine. "You're the only one who can stop this." Before I could argue, she pushed me toward the stairs. I stumbled, my heart breaking as I looked back to see the figure closing in on her. She turned to face it, her hands raised as if to ward it off. I ran, tears streaming down my face as I climbed the stairs to the second floor. The air grew colder with each step, the shadows darker and more oppressive. I didn't know where I was going, but something was guiding me, pulling me toward the library. The room was just as I had left it, the stack of yearbooks still sitting on the table. But now, the books were glowing faintly, their covers pulsing with an eerie light. I approached them cautiously, my hands trembling as I reached for the top book. The pages flipped on their own, stopping at a photo of the school's main entrance. The shadowy figure was there, its face turned toward the camera. And beneath the photo, scrawled in blood-red ink, were the words, "The cycle must end." I didn't know what it meant, but I knew what I had to do. I grabbed the book and ran back to the hallway, my heart pounding. The figure was there, its shadow stretching toward me like a living thing. Mrs. Calloway was gone. I held up the book, the words glowing brighter as the figure advanced. It let out a deafening roar, its form flickering like a dying flame. The shadows recoiled, and the air grew warmer, the oppressive weight lifting. The figure lunged at me, its hands outstretched, but I didn't flinch. I opened the book, the pages glowing with an intense, blinding light. The figure let out one final ear-piercing scream as it was sucked into the pages, its form dissolving into smoke. The book slammed shut, the light fading. The hallway was silent once more, the air still and calm. I stood there, my hands trembling as I held the book, its cover cold and unyielding. The doors opened, and the sunlight streamed in, warm and inviting. I walked out of the school, the book clutched tightly in my hands. The year was over, but the memories of that day would haunt me forever. Even now, years later, I can still feel the weight of the book in my hands, the faint hum of its power. I keep it locked away, hidden where no one can find it. But sometimes, late at night, I hear the rustling of pages and the faint, haunting whispers of the classroom that never truly emptied. The last dismissal. I never expected that a final day of school could unspool into a nightmare so profound that every memory, every echo, would twist into terror. Yet on that autumn afternoon at Eastbridge High, as the last dismissal beeped over the intercom and the final class spilled out into the cool light of early evening, I, Connor Hale, was drawn back instead of running toward freedom. There was something in the silence of the empty corridors that called to me, a silent promise of revelations too grim to believe. The day had begun with the ordinary chaos of graduation, anxious smiles, tearful goodbyes, and relief mingled with the bittersweet tang of parted childhoods. But as the final bell rang, its dying chime resonating oddly, almost mournfully. The ecstatic flood of students vanished from the campus like a tide receding, leaving Eastbridge High cloaked in eerie stillness. I lingered in the main atrium, where the vaulted ceiling and stained glass windows cast kaleidoscopic hues upon the deserted halls. Instead of rejoicing in summer's liberation, I felt a strange pull, an invitation from the very walls. I stepped away from the atrium toward the old library, retracing steps I had taken many times before. Every corridor I passed seemed subtly altered. The cheerful chatter that usually resonated in the background was replaced with an oppressive hush, punctuated only by the distant creak of aging floorboards. Faded motivational posters and dusty portraits of past headmasters glowered at me, their eyes seeming to judge my every move. There was an almost palpable sorrow in the air, a grief born of decades of forgotten farewells, where promises of tomorrow were swept away by time. Inside the library, rows upon rows of moldering books created towering labyrinths of words. Dim light filtered through grimy windows, painting the room in ashen tones. As I wandered between the stacks, a chill prickled my skin. I caught sight of an ancient yearbook open on a table, its pages yellowed and brittle. Under the click portraits and cheerful memories was scribbled a single line in a hurried, almost frantic scrawl. Our voices drown in silence, our stories lost to time. Remember us. The message seethed with despair. I felt as though unseen eyes glanced over my shoulder, and for a moment the hush broke with an indistinct murmur, a half-heard plea that sent my heart into a frantic rhythm. In that moment, the library's silence was pierced by a soft, rhythmic tapping. I followed the sound into a secluded wing of the building, where light barely penetrated the thick dust swirling in the air. The tapping came from behind a heavy wooden door marked storage. My hand trembled as I pushed it open. I expected to find abandoned supplies or forgotten memorabilia. Instead, I discovered a single battered locker standing upright in the center of an otherwise empty room. Its paint was chipped, revealing blackened metal beneath. On its surface, faint scratches, almost poetic in their arrangement, spelled out words I couldn't immediately decipher. The tapping persisted from behind the locker, as if something were desperately trying to be released. I reached out and caressed its cold surface. A whisper echoed through the corridor, a pleading, broken sound that might have been the rustle of paper or the cry of a ghost. The locker's handle shivered in my hand, even after I grasped it. Then, slowly, as if in reluctant compliance, the locker door swung open to reveal a black void within, far deeper than any locker should be. My pulse accelerated as a wind, inexplicable and frigid, burst from the opening. It carried with it the faint scent of decay and the echo of anguished voices. I staggered back, swallowing hard, realizing that I had just glimpsed the entrance to something older and far more malignant than I could have imagined. I left the storage room, my mind reeling, and retraced my steps toward the main corridor. The school felt as though it were alive, its walls heaving slowly, its floors vibrating with the weight of unspoken tragedy. Shadows moved where there was no light, and doors I swore had been locked now lay ajar, opening onto vast, unfamiliar hallways. I passed the science labs, where shattered beakers and dried-up experiments testified to past fervor. Yet even those spaces seemed consumed by a quiet desolation, as though the knowledge once harbored had decayed into sorrow. Somewhere in the distance, the distant tolling of a bell resonated, a sound that was not celebratory, nor was it a signal for dismissal. It was a dirge. Compelled by equal parts terror and the desperate need to understand, I made my way upward along the main staircase. Each step creaked a lament, as if the building mourned its own decay. At the top, I entered a corridor lined with lockers. Their doors were flung open, and inside, I glimpsed fragments of personal histories, tattered photos, forgotten textbooks, scraps of diaries. One locker in particular caught my eye. Its door was inscribed in a scrawled hand, "Don't forget me." The inscription, now faded, radiated an aura of hopelessness. I pressed my hand against it, as if trying to seal a promise, and I couldn't tell whether it was the chill of the metal or the weight of centuries of lost innocence that sent shivers throughout my body. I emerged onto the second floor, where the air grew denser and time itself seemed to slow. In a classroom at the end of the hall, the remnants of a lesson were frozen in disarray. A chalkboard covered in cryptic equations, desks overturned as if in a hurry to escape, and on the wall, a smear of what might have been a hastily scrawled note that read, "The final dismissal is not an ending. It is a beginning." I stared at the words, feeling my heart sink deeper into dread with each syllable. Was it a warning from beyond, or merely the ramblings of a troubled mind? I couldn't tell, but I knew that no one had left this school satisfied that day. Something terrible had taken root. As twilight yielded to the threatening darkness of night, I found myself desperate for an exit, a passage back to the world outside, where the terror of the past would be nothing more than a bad memory. Yet every door I tried only revealed more corridors, endless passages that twisted in impossible geometry. The lights overhead began to flicker and die one by one, plunging sections of the school into darkness so complete I could almost sense it swallowing every sound. Now and then, a voice would whisper in the silence, a name, a plea, half-formed words that seemed to beg for acknowledgement. I felt a terrible loneliness, as if I were the sole witness to a sorrow shared by thousands. Drawn inexorably to the front of the building, I finally reached what appeared to be an exit, a grand set of double doors in the administrative wing, ornate and heavy, promising escape. I pushed against them with all my might, but they would not budge. I tried again and again until my arms ached. Through a narrow window near the doors, I saw only the pitch-black night outside, impenetrable and unyielding, as if the world beyond had been swallowed by the school's malignant hunger. A sound then halted my futile struggle, a low, rhythmic tapping, louder and more insistent than before. It came from beneath the floor, from an unseen source that vibrated the very ground beneath my feet. I staggered back, heart pounding. The tapping grew to a crescendo, joined by a discordant chorus of whispers that now filled the air with unbearable grief. It was as if the building were speaking directly to me, its voice a testimony to every final day, every lost hope that had ever been abandoned within these walls. Then, amid this paroxysm of despair, I sensed a transformation. The oppressive static of sorrow was punctured by flashes of terrible visions, images of past students roaming the corridors, their faces etched with agony and resignation, ephemeral forms drifting slowly through classrooms, eyes hollow as if they had never known joy, and a towering figure at the center of it all, a spectral principal with eyes of burning regret and a voice that resonated like the toll of doom. It raised an outstretched hand as if to beckon me into its fold. Its presence filled me with a mixture of terror and a maddening, impossible empathy. I felt its grief, as though it were my own. I fell to my knees as that figure advanced, its gaze piercing through my very soul. 100 voices cried out in unison, voices that weren't entirely hostile, but which carried a desperate plea for release. "Stay with us, remember us, forever." The words repeated like an incantation that threatened to obliterate my sense of self. I tried to scream, to plead for mercy, but my voice was swallowed by the overwhelming chorus of sorrow. Time became a ceaseless spiral of agony. I was no longer sure if I was still alive, or if I had become yet another fragment in the mosaic of misery that was Eastbridge High. The building, once a host to youthful triumphs and trivial squabbles, was now a mausoleum of lost souls. Every final dismissal, every graduation, had been captured and fixed into its stone and wood, a cycle of despair that would never cease. In the final moments of my fading consciousness, as the spectral figures drew closer and the rhythmic tapping faded into a thundering heartbeat beneath my skin, I recognized the horrifying inevitability of my fate. There was no escape, no salvation, only the unyielding, perpetual mourning of a place that refused to let go of its legacy of pain. My identity began to dissolve into the endless lament, a single quivering echo among thousands forever bound to the corridors of Eastbridge High. And so, as darkness claimed every last vestige of hope, I realized that the final dismissal was not a farewell to freedom. It was the beginning of an eternal sentence. The school's malignant hold was total, its shadow unending, and I, too, would join its choir of lost souls, a silent witness to a final day that resounded in endless horror.